They handed us the manuals before they gave us rifles, before uniforms, before names. The cover was standard issue plasteel binding, stamped with the sigil of our world's planetary defense force, a stylized shield behind a las gun, haloed in the light of the Emperor's blessing, the kind of symbol you're supposed to feel proud of, the kind that makes you stand straighter in line. I remember thinking it was heavier than it looked. The paper inside wasn't paper at all, but some waxy composite that smelled faintly of machine oil, a chemical tang, sharp enough to sting the nose. We were told to turn to the first page. There were only 6 words. Congratulations, you're already dead. No explanation, no preface, no oath to the Emperor or pledge to the planet, just that. The instructors let the silence hang. You could hear boots scuffing on the parade ground, the rattle of someone's canteen, the wind sliding dust over ferrocrete. One recruit, a farmhand from the southern valleys, laughed under his breath. The nearest sergeant hit him in the gut with a shock baton, dropped him to his knees. The rest of us stayed quiet. That was my first lesson. Questions get you noticed. Being noticed gets you punished. We were ordered to commit the line to memory, not just to remember the words, to believe them. Every order you follow, every shot you fire, every breath you take in service is already borrowed, the captain told us. You died when you signed your name. The manual is here to make sure you're useful after. We thought it was just rhetoric, a way to break us down, but the manual stayed with us, always. We were to keep it on our person at all times, even when sleeping, even during hygiene cycles. If it was lost, damaged, or altered in any way, the penalty was execution. I didn't know then that page 1 was the safest part. We were marched to the barracks after induction. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and hot metal. Old bulkheads still bore the faded paint lines of some other garrison long gone. Bunk assignments were carved into the floor plates, not printed or painted, deep, deliberate gouges. On the wall above my bed, someone had scratched a tiny cog symbol into the plasteel, not deep, almost hesitant. It wasn't standard PDF insignia. I traced it with a fingertip that night and felt a static buzz run up my arm. When I checked in the morning, it was gone. No mark, no scar on the metal. The first training day began before dawn. The siren sounded, low and warbling, echoing through the barracks like a wounded animal. Every recruit scrambled into boots and jackets, manuals in hand. Our first drill wasn't weapons handling. It wasn't formation marching. It was playing dead. We were ordered to lie face down in the dirt, manuals open to page 1, and remain completely still for 3 hours. The instructors walked among us, shouting, kicking at heels, dragging boots through the dust. Anyone who moved was hauled to their feet, read their page 1 aloud, and then sent back down again. When the hours were over, no one asked why. We just stood up and kept our eyes front. That's when I noticed something. The manuals of those who had been punished looked different. The black ink on page 1 wasn't quite black anymore. In certain light, it shimmered faintly red. 2 days later, during a march to the live fire range, it happened for the first time. The recruit in front of me, I never learned his name, froze mid-step. Not a stumble, not a collapse. One instant moving, the next still. His rifle dropped into the dust, his knees locked, and he didn't blink. We all saw it. The sergeant shouted, "Ignore it," without breaking stride. We marched around him. By the time we returned, the spot was empty. The rifle was gone. The dust where he'd stood was smooth, like the wind had erased him. That night, his bunk was made perfectly. At roll call, the clerk read his name as present. The manuals had more than 1 page, but none of us were allowed to turn beyond the first. Any attempt, even in secret, was met with swift correction. A boy from the mining settlements tried during lights out. He used the edge of his mess knife to prise the page over without making a sound. We all heard the scream, not from him, from the manual itself. It was thin and high, like tearing metal played backward, vibrating in our bones. The lights came on instantly, instructors flooding the room. They dragged him out. We didn't see him again. But the next morning, there was a new bunk in our bay, a fresh recruit. His manual looked brand new. His eyes didn't. I kept noticing things. The manuals weren't numbered. Page 1 had no 1 on it. And in different lights, the texture seemed to shift, like the letters were carved into the surface rather than printed. One night, I swore the letters rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. Weeks later, during a storm, the barracks lights cut out for several minutes. In that blackout, the manuals glowed faintly, not bright, just enough to outline the words on the first page in a sickly blue-white. And in that dimness, I thought I saw more words bleeding through from deeper in the book. Shapes, diagrams, lists. They faded when the power came back. When questioned, their faces locked into the same blank expression. The kind you see on statues. The kind you can't quite believe belongs to a living man. But here's what I learned. Every order we followed was building to something. Every strange drill, every unexplained rule, every punishment, it all tied back to page 1. It wasn't just an opening line, it was a promise. And I think it's already been kept. If you ever hold one of these manuals, you'll want to think it's just words. You'll want to think you can ignore them. But that's the first mistake. The second is reading the next page. And the third, you don't get a third. We thought we'd moved past the first page absurdity. We were wrong. Weapons training began on the 6th day, but not the way we'd imagined. The rifles were ancient, chipped lasguns, some with dials worn smooth from decades of use. We lined up on the range under the bitter wind that always seemed to follow us. Manuals tucked under our left arms like scripture. Before we could fire a single shot, the sergeants drilled us on holding positions. Not aiming, not breathing techniques, stillness, heels locked, back straight, eyes front. If the wind howled dust into your face, you ignored it. If sweat slid into your eyes, you let it burn. We learned that discipline here meant less about shooting and more about becoming furniture. Furniture that could kill on command. We were told never to disassemble our rifles without an instructor present, never adjust the power cells, never wipe the optics clean without permission. One recruit, a wiry kid from the outer ruins, decided to clean his lasgun during break. When the instructor found him, he made the boy lie down in the dirt and placed the weapon across his chest, muzzle under his chin. We were ordered to stand in formation and watch. The sergeant knelt beside him, whispered something we couldn't hear, and pressed the firing stud. The lasgun clicked. No beam, no noise but the wind. The boy was sent back to his bunk with the weapon still across his chest. He didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The play dead drills never stopped. They weren't punishment anymore, they were scheduled into our daily routine. 2 hours before dawn, we'd be dragged out to the exercise field, ordered to collapse as if dead, manuals open to page 1, and stay like that until the instructors called time. The ground was always coldest just before the sun rose. You could feel the heat leach out of your body into the dirt, breath fogging the air in slow, shallow plumes. Every heartbeat felt louder than it should. Sometimes you could hear movement in the dark, not boots, not animals, something heavier, and then you'd feel it, pressure, like the ground beneath you was interested. If you twitched, the sergeants would haul you upright, make you read page 1 aloud, and then order you back down. Formation training followed the same philosophy, obedience without context. We were drilled to march in perfect sync, eyes fixed forward, turning corners at precise angles without hesitation. But our formations weren't just for parade. We were trained to arrange ourselves in strange shapes, spirals, jagged lines, mirrored patterns. No one explained why. One day, after we formed a perfect concentric circle around the drill square, I caught a glimpse of the senior instructors watching from the balcony. Their heads were tilted at the exact same angle, hands clasped behind their backs. None of them moved the entire time. The manual kept coming back. During breaks, the sergeants made us read specific sentences from deeper in the book, sentences we couldn't find again later. One day it might be "stand where you fall." The next, "every shadow is a doorway." They never told us what page those words were on. We began to notice changes in the recruits. The ones who'd been here the longest, the old guard, moved differently, too smoothly. When they stood still, they didn't sway like a living body does to keep balance. They were statues until they moved, and then it was sudden, precise and final. One of them shared a bunk bay with me. I never saw him blink. The worst came during the discipline cycle. It was a week-long regimen with no sleep longer than 90 minutes, food rations cut in half, and constant drills. We were ordered to keep our manuals open at all times, page 1 staring back. By the 4th day, recruits started collapsing mid-step. Not from exhaustion, something else. Their bodies went rigid, eyes glassy, like the boy on the range. When it happened, the instructors didn't call medics. They took the manuals from the fallen, held them to the soldier's chest, and whispered quietly, Every single one of those recruits was back in formation the next day. No limp, no fatigue, but when you looked in their eyes, something was missing. We were never allowed to compare manuals. When one recruit from my squad tried to swap books with another, the sergeant's whistle cut through the air. The two manuals were snatched, the owners made to kneel in the mud, and the rest of us ordered to march in a wide circle around them for an hour. By the end, the recruits' boots had sunk deep into the sludge. When they were finally pulled free, I swear the mud clung to their ankles longer than it should have. The final exercise of the week was the hollow drill. We were ordered to stand at attention, manuals pressed to our chests, and close our eyes. No movement, no sound. Minutes passed, then hours. The wind rose, carrying with it faint, rhythmic vibrations, not footsteps, not engines. When I opened my eyes just a slit, I saw shadows moving across the parade ground, not cast by anything above. They slid over the dirt, slow and deliberate, curling around the boots of the instructors. One passed over me, and for a moment, the manual in my hands felt warm. The march to the live fire range began under the same grey sky that had been hanging over us for weeks. It wasn't clouds. The instructors told us the atmosphere here was temperate, but it always felt like the sun was hidden behind something. We fell into formation outside the barracks, manuals under our left arms, Lars guns slung to our right. The wind came from the east, carrying grit sharp enough to sting the skin. We moved in silence. That wasn't an order. It was just how things were now. After enough days here, words stopped coming easily. The drills had burned them out of us. The ground was hard-pan dirt, cracked like old skin. Each footstep hit with the same flat thud, over and over, an endless metronome. The sergeants didn't call cadence. They didn't need to. We were synced by now. The recruit 3 places ahead of me. A boy from the river settlements, short, wiry, always chewing the inside of his cheek, froze mid-stride. His right foot came down, knee locking, and then nothing. He didn't stumble, didn't flinch, didn't drop his Lars gun. His spine went rigid, eyes fixed straight ahead, and the rhythm of his breathing stopped. We marched past him. The sergeant's voice came low and cold. Ignore it. No one broke formation. No one looked back. The sound of our boots swallowed the moment. The boy's stillness was gone behind us, absorbed by the monotony of the march. But I couldn't shake it. I'd seen exhaustion before, during the discipline cycle, in the freezing pre-dawn play-dead drills. But this wasn't that. This was subtraction, something removed from the world. By the time we reached the range, it was like he'd never been there at all. The live fire range was a stretch of churned earth, bordered by rusted metal barricades and burnt-out vehicle husks. Static-laced target drones moved on creaking rails, some jerking like their servos were broken. We were given a fresh power cell each, told to fire in short, controlled bursts. The sergeants paced behind us, hands behind their backs. Every time I sighted down the barrel, the wind shifted. Dust slid between my visor's seal and my cheek. It felt deliberate. When the exercise ended, the instructors collected the power cells. We were ordered back into formation for the march home. Halfway back, I saw the boy again. He was standing exactly where he'd frozen earlier. Same stance, same rigid posture. His Lars gun was gone now, manual clutched to his chest like a child holding a toy. We passed within arm's reach. His eyes were open but unfocused, pupils dilated until they were almost black. The sergeant's voice again, ignore it. By the time the last recruit passed him, the boy moved. Not slowly, instantly, like a frame skipped in reality. He went from stillness to stepping back into formation without a single transition. No one made space for him. He didn't need it. His boots hit the ground in perfect sync with ours, and his face showed nothing. Back in the barracks, his bunk was made. His kit was polished. The only difference was his manual. Its cover now had a faint red sheen in the light, like the altered books from the play-dead punishments. That night, during lights out, I heard him breathing differently from the rest of us. Not steady, not human. It was in time with something far away, a deep, slow rhythm, like machinery turning in the dark. 2 days later, it happened again. This time, It was a girl from the hive outskirts. She fell still mid-march, her shadow stretching out across the dust at an angle that didn't match the sun. Again, ignore it. When she returned to formation, her manual was glowing faintly in the dim overcast. Only for a second, but long enough for me to see the words on page 1 shifting, rearranging themselves into symbols I didn't recognize. Will I freeze, be left behind, and then return? Different. The instructors never explained it, never acknowledged it. But I began to suspect that this was the real training, not marksmanship, not formations, but removal, a process. One evening after a collapse, I broke the unspoken rule. I looked back. The recruit who'd frozen was still in place, but something was wrong with the air around him. The dust wasn't moving right. It swirled inward, toward his boots, like he was a drain in the earth. I saw the manual on his chest lift slightly, as if something beneath the surface was breathing. Then he was gone. Not vanished, just not there. And when I blinked, he was in formation again, 2 files behind me, manual under his arm, face blank. The words were there, black as always, but for a moment, I thought I saw something behind them, shapes, faint outlines, diagrams like the ones I'd glimpsed during the blackout in the barracks. And then, for the first time, I noticed the texture of the page under my fingertips. It wasn't smooth. It had a pulse. Every time someone comes back from the first silence, they're not entirely them anymore. And I think the manual knows. The manual was always with us, not because we wanted it there, but because it had to be. The sergeants never said it outright, but you learned fast. If you were caught without it, you'd regret it. Recruits whispered stories about punishment drills that lasted days without food or sleep, but no one had actually seen them happen. That was the thing. The worst punishments weren't witnessed. They were remembered into existence by rumor. The first whisper about missing pages came during kit inspection. We'd been ordered to open our manuals to page 1, hold them at chest height, and recite the opening line in unison. Congratulations, you're already dead. One recruit in the next file over, a tall man with a flat scar across his jaw, didn't move his lips. His eyes were locked on something deeper in the book, not page 1. The sergeant noticed. He didn't shout, didn't even raise his voice. He simply stepped forward, took the manual from the man's hands, and held it open for a moment. Then he closed it, handed it back, and moved on. The next day, that man's bunk was empty. His gear remained. The manual sat on his pillow, closed, untouched. Older recruits had a name for it, crossing the threshold. They said the manual didn't contain all its pages at once, that the book you carried wasn't just paper and ink, it was a kind of gate, and pages only appeared when you were ready for them, or when you weren't. Some said the missing sections were written in codes only the dead could read. Others claimed the manual didn't change at all, that it was you that changed, and suddenly you understood what was always there. I dismissed it as barracks superstition until Orla saw page 50. Orla was from one of the spire hives, her accent clipped and harsh. She was sharp, fast with a rifle, and had a habit of reading the manual alone during downtime. One evening, after lights out, I woke to the sound of paper turning. She was sitting cross-legged on her bunk, manual open in her lap, eyes darting back and forth like she was reading faster than humanly possible. Her hands trembled, but she didn't stop. The book was open somewhere near the middle. I could see the block of pages split evenly between her hands. Then her breathing changed. It went shallow, clipped. Her head tilted like she was listening to something inside the paper. I whispered her name. She didn't hear me. Lalway. The next morning, she was still in bed. Manual closed, eyes open. She didn't speak at breakfast, didn't speak during drills, didn't even answer when the sergeant barked her name. It wasn't mutiny. It was as if the part of her that made speech possible had been erased. The other recruits avoided her after that. The instructors didn't acknowledge the change at all. By the end of the week, she'd stopped eating, but she kept marching. Her boots hit the dirt in perfect rhythm with ours. Manual clutched under her arm, eyes forward, jaw slack. When I finally worked up the courage to ask one of the veterans what happened to her, he just said, she saw something she wasn't dead enough to understand. Every recruit who vanished after looking too far in their manual had been here at least a month. Every one of them had gone through the first silence freeze at least once, and every one of them had a faint, oily sheen on their manual after it happened. One night, I decided to check my own book. I sat up in my bunk after lights out, using the dim red glow from the corridor to read. Page 1 stared back at me. I flipped slowly, 2, 3, All the usual material, standing orders, drills, doctrine. Page 10. I stopped. The paper felt thicker than it should. The ink bled slightly at the edges, shapes that looked almost like veins. I flipped faster. Page 20. Page 30. Every one felt heavier than the last, as if the book was absorbing warmth from my hands. When I reached page 49, the air in the barracks shifted. Not temperature, pressure. My ears popped. I put my thumb under the next page. It wasn't a trick of the wind or my own nerves. The paper flexed like it was resisting, like muscle tensing under skin. My thumbnail pressed against it and felt something warm beneath. The bunk creaked above me, someone shifting in their sleep. But when I looked up, the recruit in the top bunk was sitting perfectly still, staring down at my manual. His lips didn't move, but in my head, I heard, "Don't." The pressure in the air vanished, the hum of the ventilation returning like nothing had happened. The next morning, the recruit who'd warned me was gone, his bunk stripped bare. In his place, on the mattress, was a manual. No name, no unit number. Its cover was blank except for a single number burned into the leather. 50 don't. I didn't open it. Not then. But every day since, I've felt the urge building, like the manual wants me to, and I think I know what will happen if I do. I'll stop speaking, I'll stop eating, and maybe I'll finally be dead enough to understand. The siren that woke us at 03 never sounded like an alarm. It was a single rising thread, thin enough to slide between thoughts and hook them together. The barracks didn't jolt awake, it tilted toward wakefulness, as if the sound leaned the world and we rolled out of our bunks because gravity had been given a new idea. We grabbed our manuals before boots, then boots before breath. No one asked why. By now the manual had taught us the shape of obedience. You move first, you think later, you understand last. The corridor lumens were dimmed to a bruised dark red. In that light, the instructor's eyes reflected like wet glass. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their hands behind their backs were enough. Wrists parallel, thumbs touching, a posture we would see again in places where hands were not required to be human. We filed past and into the parade ground. 4 floodlight towers coughed white cones into a sky that swallowed everything beyond arm's length. The beams cut up and died in the low haze, leaving a hard-edged square of visibility on the ferrocrete. Beyond that boundary lay blackness that wasn't emptiness but occupied air. We took our marks on a ghosted grid of paint, 2 arm lengths apart, manuals pressed to chest, page 1 displayed like a pass, bare heads, no rifles, cold decking seeping through boot soles, windlass, stand still, eyes front, witness, a drill master said. Then he folded his hands again and became a statue. Silence thickened. I could feel the manual's waxy composite warm against my palms, a counterpoint to the slow leach of heat from my feet. If I shifted the book a fraction, the floodlight glare slid across the first line and made the letters look carved, not printed. Congratulations, you're already dead. On night watch, that sentence stopped sounding like cruelty and started behaving like a credential. We carried it forward, like an embassy carries papers through a border that can't be seen in daylight. Nothing happened for a long time. That was the first lesson. Night watch wasn't spectacle, it was endurance with the promise of meaning. We stood until knees trembled, and when they did, we learned that tremble is just another kind of stillness if you don't let it travel. Breath became slow and shallow, a discipline the manual had already trained into us with the play dead drills. After an hour, the floodlights blinked once in perfect unison, as if 4 sets of eyelids had closed, and in that heartbeat of dimness, the black beyond the beams seemed to lean. When the lights steadied, the darkness had returned to its mark, as polite as a dog outside a threshold. On the 3rd night watch, the wind died earlier than the siren. The base listened to itself. The vents hushed. The generators forgot to hum. When the single note rose, we were already upright. Floodlights ignited with a soft hydraulic sigh. The square filled with the precise geometry of bodies at attention. Out beyond the fence, something shifted. Not a shadow thrown by a shape that edited the shadows around it. The chain link did not rattle. It settled, and remembered that it was a boundary, not a voice. "Do not turn," the drill master said, so quietly it felt impolite to agree. I didn't. My eyes tilted anyway. At the exact place where the light thinned, The dark met its edge and tested the seam the way a tongue tests the place where a tooth used to be. My manual warmed 1 degree. Page 1 pulsed under my thumb the way a throat does before it speaks. The 4th night watch. They took our boots. Learn the ground, a sergeant said, and that was all. Bare soles found the grid through dust and paint. The square was warmer than the air. Day heat still hiding in concrete, but in certain squares, old stains or old repairs ran cold, and the difference climbed my bones like a code. When we stepped from one to the next, the temperature spoke in a sequence I could almost memorize. Warm, warm, cool, cool, warm. Later, the manual's map would draw that exact pattern down a corridor that didn't exist. For now, it was just discomfort with intention. On the 6th, they issued earplugs and told us not to use them unless the signal was given. The signal was never given. The earplugs lived in our pockets like small promises of relief we were meant to decline. I started to hear things the earplugs would have stolen. A slow, regular creak from somewhere past the fence, not metal, not animal. The crisp tick of expansion in the floodlight housings as they adjusted to night chill. The sifting whisper of dust settling back onto paint where bodies had displaced it. Hearing became watching. By the 9th, I noticed the instructor's timing. When one lifted his sensor, yes, sensor, they'd brought them from a mechanicus cupboard and swung them like priests. The other 3 matched the arc to the degree. Incense burned my sinuses and laid metal on my tongue. The smoke passed the line between light and not light, and then, without thinning, decided it would go no farther. It puddled like liquid around the boundary. I watched the drill master's eyes catch floodlight, blank and reflective like stones in a river. When an anxious recruit began to whisper a prayer to the emperor, a drill master passed him and said, without looking, "Do not pray, stand." I have never heard a sentence so kind and so cold in one breath. The 11th, the floodlights did not come on. We filed into blackness with only the siren's single tone for company, and found our places by counting paces, by the feel of cool paint lines under toes, by the bodies near us remembering where we should be. After some number of breaths, the manuals lit themselves. No beam, just a drowsy blue, just enough to float page 1 in the air. At that angle I saw, under the printed line, faint ghost shapes, diagrams too complex to belong in an infantry handbook. When the pages warmed, the ghosts swam closer to the surface like fish beneath ice. Something touched the line in front of my feet. Not a foot, not a hand. A decision. It pressed against the paint, met a rule written into the ground by habit and drill, and let go. The pressure left behind a ripple, like a ring in water when nothing falls in. The manual thrummed once, and cooled again. The 13th night watch rewrote "Ignore it." A recruit 3 files over turned his manual to page 2. No one moved to stop him. No one could admit there was a page 2. The floodlights held steady. The instructors held their hands. The dark leaned forward, the smallest degree. He looked down, exhaled in surrender, and folded as if his strings had been cut. He did not convulse. He did not plead. He lay on the grid, cheek against paint, manual open like a wound. At dismissal, we filed around him. At dawn, his bunk was made, his kit squared, his name called present. The only proof he had ever been more than an arrangement of muscle and obedience was the oily sheen on the manual left on his pillow. By the 15th, we could stand through anything. Rain came once but did not fall. It condensed, beading along our brows and manuals in evenly spaced drops that made page 1 glisten as if it had sweat. The beads sat without soaking in, then rolled to the gutter in the concrete, and left the square as perfect as before. I licked iron from my lip and did not think of blood. On the 18th, the fence had moved. No one mentioned it at muster. The posts were 10 meters farther out, new cement still raw at their feet, triple locks visible as bright nodes on the gate. The locks had no keyholes. Beyond, the ruins were where they had always been, except for the ways they weren't. The grid under our feet matched neither map I knew. A drill master walked the line and paused at me. He didn't look down, he regarded. Page 1 warmed as if held under a lamp, then cooled. He moved on. The 21st taught me night watch was not a test but a treaty. Witness, the drill master said, and in the word I heard a second voice riding his, too quiet to be sound, too clear to be accident. The manual heard it better than I did. It warmed. Later, In the wasteland beyond the fence, when the manuals would begin to flip pages on their own, I would remember the undertone in Witness and realize the book had been translating for us. The 24th, shadows within the circle did something shadows do not do. They pointed toward the floodlights. For 3 beats, our bodies threw darkness the wrong way. Then geometry remembered itself. I saw 2 veterans in the next file relax their jaws at the same time, as if clenching had been the only thing holding the world in place. The instructors did not blink. On the 27th, at 3:37, the manuals hummed in a left-right-left sequence that made the floodlights answer a blink later. I didn't know the cadence yet. Later the map would erase itself and leave a single word, forward, and the only way to read the bass would be to listen for that rhythm. I caught it like a tune and stored it behind my teeth. The 30th night watch. Something paced the fence. Not heavy, measured. The chain accepted the touch without complaint. The floodlights brightened a fractional degree. The darkness accepted the courtesy and did not step in. A drill master passed and murmured, not to us but to the manuals. Good. Page 1 warmed. I swallowed the need to nod. By the 33rd we woke before the siren. Our bodies had learned the time the way they'd learned stillness, as a number etched into meat. We filed into the square in silence, teeth chattering in unison until they didn't. When the single note finally came, it felt less like a call and more like a confirmation. Yes, you are where you should be. The floodlights rose without a click, and the world arrived exactly the size we had allowed it. Someone always breaks on night watch. It was my bunkmate on the 36th. He swayed once, whispered something into his manual, maybe an apology, maybe a dare, and turned a page with 2 fingers like a man peeling a bandage. I watched his throat work. The dark did nothing. After a long, thin breath, he closed the book again with both palms flat, and shook. He didn't fall. I don't know what he saw. He did not speak the next day. He marched well. When the siren chirped dismissal, we returned along the corridor in 2 files. Bare feet left perfect prints that the night vent system erased with chemical breath. The instructors watched us pass, and for an instant I saw not their faces, not their eyes. Their posture echoed precisely in the shadows on the wall, as if the floodlights were remembering them with a different angle of light. Then we were back in bunks and the barracks embraced the fiction of sleep. Night watch taught us 3 things we did not know we were learning. First, the world ends where the light does, and the light can be trained. Second, page 1 is a passport, not a warning. Third, silence is not absence, it is an agreement. Weeks later, when the firing range would have no targets, when the maps in the manual would show corridors that did not exist at noon, when the gates would lock from the inside and the books would erase everything but forward, those lessons would be the only things that didn't move when the rest of the base did. For now the dark waited, the floodlights blinked left, right, left, and we stood with our credentials pressed to our hearts, already dead and learning how to behave.
It began without the sound of absence. No gasp in the dark, no shuffle of feet, no scrape of a bunk frame against ferrocrete. In the barracks, when someone leaves their bed, whether to relieve themselves, to grab water, to pace away nightmares, you hear it. That night, there was only sleep, or something like it. We woke to the usual half-light of 05 muster, rows of bunks squared to parade ground precision, footlockers flush with their shadows, manuals centered on folded blankets, the smell of disinfectant, not the harsh sting of a fresh scrub, but the faint metallic breath of a room that has been still for hours. The absence showed itself only when one of the instructors passed down the aisle. His boots clicked in a rhythm every recruit had memorized. 4 paces, pause, turn, 4 paces back. When he stopped beside that bunk, we knew something was wrong because the pause came 2 beats too long. The bunk was perfect, blanket pulled tight enough to drum, pillow centered like a skull on display, manual resting on top, page 1 showing as if the book had never been opened in life. But the recruit, Manus, short, soft-spoken, with a habit of whispering the manual's text under his breath, was not there. The instructor's gaze didn't waver. He didn't look around the room. He didn't ask. He simply moved on. The pause was the only acknowledgement. When the roll call began, I was ready for his name to be skipped, ready for the absence to be formalized. Instead, the sergeant's voice rolled through the list, as if reading from a sheet, engraved in stone years before. Marnus Jack present. It wasn't a question, so there was no room for an answer. But the silence after was different, tight, packed with the things no one dared to say. Our line stood a fraction straighter, as if posture could hide the way the word present had landed. After muster, routines were followed with surgical precision. Weapons drills, manual study, march formation practice. The instructor's eyes passed over the gap in our number without hesitation. At meals, Marnus's tray sat at the edge of our table, steaming identically to the rest, untouched. The seat stayed empty, but the space around it behaved as if he might arrive at any moment. That night, his locker was locked. The day before, I'd seen it ajar, a corner of his undershirt caught in the hinge. Now it was sealed. I tried not to look, but my eyes slid back to it, each time the lights dimmed another degree towards sleep. I had shared a night watch file with Marnus twice. He was the sort who counted his steps under his breath, who noticed the way the floodlights hummed differently on damp nights, who could stand still with an ease that made it seem like he'd been waiting his whole life to be told to. There was nothing in him that suggested disobedience, and nothing about him that suggested he'd vanish on his own. On the second day, the barracks had adjusted to his absence. No talk, no questions. His tray was gone from the mess line. His name was still called at roll, still answered by silence, still accepted as truth. The bunk stayed made. The instructors began posting the night guards inside the barracks, not just at the outer gates. 2 stood at the far end of the aisle each night, eyes forward, hands clasped behind backs in that same perfect posture. They weren't watching for escape attempts. They were there to observe whatever it was that took people without sound. By the third day, the air in the barracks felt wrong in a way the manual would not define. The manuals define wrongness in numbers, in procedures, in neat hierarchies of correction. This wrongness was in the skin, in the way the light slid across polished floor and left something in shadow that shouldn't have been. On the 4th day, another bed was made too perfectly. This time it was Rallis, whose voice was too loud, and whose faith in the Emperor could have burned holes in steel. He had been at morning drill. At mid-meal he was gone. No sound, no witness, just an empty bunk remade to regulation perfection. Manual on top. His name was called at roll. Present. Accepted. That night I kept my manual open under the blanket, pretending to sleep. I told myself I'd watch, that I'd catch the absence before it fully formed. My eyes fought me. At some point, the manual began to feel heavier on my chest, as if gravity had been given an extra task. I blinked, and an hour was gone. Across the aisle, the bunk where Rallis had been was empty, but the blanket was smoothed. The pillow was centered. The manual lay open, page 1 looking as though it had been waiting. By the 6th day, we had stopped thinking of the vanishings as events. They were part of the rhythm, the way reveille came at the same pitch every morning, the way the instructor's eyes never quite matched their smiles. We began counting in reverse, how many left, not how many present. The manuals grew heavier in the hands. I thought about weighing mine, but there was no scale in the barracks, and the manual would likely show a different weight each time I tried. At night, when the siren called us to night watch, I would swear the page 1 letters were thicker, as if the ink had been applied again. The warmth of the page sometimes pulsed, slow and patient, as though measuring my heartbeat. One night, after returning from the square, I reached my bunk and found my manual on the pillow instead of the footlocker. It was open, not to page 1, but to something that should have been blank. There were faint lines too pale to read unless the light hit them at the right angle. When it did, I saw my name at the top, followed by a date. Tomorrow's date. I closed it, returned it to the locker, and lay down without undressing. I didn't sleep. Morning came, and I was still in the bunk. The date had passed, and the manual was closed on page 1 again. I didn't check for the lines. Some knowledge is an invitation, and I wasn't ready to RSVP. The vanishing stopped after the 8th. We didn't know why. Maybe the quota was met. Maybe the manual had turned its attention to something else. Or maybe, though I didn't want to think it, they hadn't stopped at all. We were just slower to notice. What I knew was this: the bunk stayed perfect. The manual stayed on page 1. And every roll call, the voices stayed steady when they said present, even when we all knew the air in the room was lighter by 1. I started keeping my boots on at night. The first time I heard the manual speak, it didn't use words. It borrowed a sound my bones already knew and handed it back to me until I mistook it for memory. It was after a night watch, the 39th by my count, the kind of count you keep in your teeth because saying numbers out loud changes them. We filed in from the square with bare soles blackened and breath slow, and the barracks had that post-ritual hush, as if the room were a church that had just closed its doors on something it didn't want to admit had come inside. I sat on my bunk and set the manual on my knees, page 1 showing like a passport, and the paper warmed my skin as if I'd laid my hands on a living flank. The warmth had been there before, subtle, explainable, a thing you could pretend came from friction or body heat. This was different. It wasn't heat traveling into me, it was pressure traveling out. The page pressed against my palms with a pulse, a beat slower than my heart, and when I matched my breathing to it, the room steadied around me. Then the sound arrived, not through the ears. If it had been audible, the snoring in the top bunks would have colored it, the distant hum of the vents would have framed it. This came up through the wrists, through the heel of the hand, through the soft pads of the fingers, an incredibly low thread, the kind of tone you feel in your molars when an engine idles just beyond the wall. It vibrated in page 1, collected itself in the line of text, then slid down into me and made a second heart somewhere below the first. Congratulations, you're already dead. If you looked at those words while the tone lived there, they didn't read as 6 units, they read as a single object with mass. The composite page flexed at the corners with the pulse, a visible tremor that would stop if you looked too directly and return when your eyes moved on. I closed the book and the pulse did not stop. It followed across the leather cover, into the spine, into the space between the boards. I set the manual aside and stood. The tone stayed under my skin for a full minute, a companionship that didn't ask permission. From then on, I listened differently. The manuals grew warmer after drill, that much we all felt. A formation march would end, and the book under my arm would heat a degree, 2 at most, a durable warmth like something that had been charging while we moved. But after certain drills, a spiral formation on the parade square, the mirrored columns exercise at dusk, the warmth would crest at the moment the sergeant dismissed us, and a second, thinner thread of tone would enter the first, making a harmony so quiet you could mistake it for relief. The veterans didn't carry theirs under the arm anymore. They kept them pressed to the sternum with both hands, elbows tucked, like guards carrying relics. During study periods, their thumbs moved along the page edges, as if following text on the other side of the paper. When a sergeant barked an order, the veterans' manuals answered with a little sigh of leather and glue. The books wanted to be moved into the shapes the bodies were already making. It would have been easier to call it superstition if the manuals hadn't started lining themselves up. After evening meal, we stacked our books on the long table in the center bay while we scrubbed boots. The stack used to be a mess. Different angles, sizes askew, the way soldiers pile things when they've been told order is for show. Now the pile always settled into a perfect column. You could see it happen if you stood at the right angle, a shuffle through the air, a minute slide, the edge of one manual tucking itself against the leather of another until all 4 corners were flush. No instructor ever commented. We learned not to either. Instructors changed too, though not the way we'd feared. They didn't grow fangs or speak Latin backward. They started lowering their voices. Commands still cracked, but in the gap between order and execution they murmured, a patter pitched for manuals, not men. If you stood close enough, and the room bothered to let you hear, you'd catch a single syllable now, with breathe, and the manuals would answer with that fingertip pulse, and the squad would move as if it had been thinking of doing so already. At first I thought we were imagining it. Sleep deprivation invents strings between things until the web is all you can see. But the evidence kept assembling itself in shapes even a spared mind would have had to acknowledge. During a weapons clean, I had the Lars gun field stripped, and the manual open beside it, as required. The book lay on page 1. We were not to move it during maintenance. The tone lived in my wrists, steady as a muffled drum. When I reassembled the rifle, the slide stuck a fraction on a burr we had all learned to curse. The manual warmed sharply. My thumb found the angle without looking, rotated the piece a single degree, and the metal seated with a sound like a decision. I hadn't known that talk. The manual had. I waited for the shame of relief, and it did not come. Next day the tone became letters. It was in the yard, mid-afternoon, shadows short and hard under knees. We were doing the mirrored pattern again, left column marching a shape, right column echoing its negative. The instructors never told us what the shapes were for. They never had to. The manuals always warmed on the same beats, cooled on the same turns. This time, as we reached the innermost spiral and locked heels in a circle, the pulse in page 1 broke into a rhythm I could read. Not language, code. Short, long, short, short. Pause, long. The pattern nested into itself, a polite little knot that my brain wanted to call a letter, even though there was nothing to see. Later, in the barracks, I traced it on the mattress with a finger. Dot, dash, dot, dot, pause, dash. It made the shape of the rune I had once found carved above my bunk and watched vanish by morning. I pressed my fingertip to the seam where mattress met frame and felt the steel answer with an almost non-existent hum, the way a string answers when another string in tune is plucked. That night the manual spoke in words for the first time, not during ritual, not on the square, in the space between breaths after lights out, when the barracks went from the clatter of men remembering to sleep to the warmth of men pretending to. The book rested on my sternum, page 1 against cloth, and the tone curled under the bone like a cat. A pressure arrived behind my right ear, the way storms sometimes announce themselves, and then a word stepped sideways into my head. Forward. Not a voice I could name, not male or female, not old or young, not kind or cruel. Just the weight of meaning rolled down a corridor it already owned. I waited for a second word. Forward stayed, a stub that wanted to grow into a sentence as soon as I gave it permission. I didn't. In the morning, the map page, strictly forbidden, allegedly locked, showed a faint line where there should have been blank administrative text. It ran from the barracks to the range and stopped at the gate we never used, the gate that had new locks and no keyholes. After drill, I asked Fex, one of the old guard, a man who could stand so still the dust forgot to settle on his shoulders when the manuals had started doing that for him. He looked at me too long, eyes reflective in the lumen light, and then shifted his manual a centimeter higher on his chest. They did not start, he said. We started to be quiet enough to hear. He walked away before I could ask what listening cost. From then on, whispers arrived at odd angles. During latrine scrub, a hold that didn't come from the sergeant and yet carried the same weight. During ration line, a small no when my hand reached for a second protein strip. In the firing lane, with ear protection on and the Lars gun's clap still living in the skull, a soft breathe that slid between beats and slowed the world enough to make the shot clean. The manual wasn't telling me anything I hadn't been ordered 100 times. It was telling it from a place in me that obeyed without the insult of being shouted at. Not everyone heard the same words. The recruit to my left flinched mid-march, and afterward admitted the book had said stop while we were moving. The one to my right slowed, smiling a tight nothing of a smile, and later revealed that his had said with a word like a hand at the elbow. We were being tuned separately, so that the formation could move as one instrument. The pages grew warmer after the silent drills, the ones where we were forced to rehearse orders in our heads and mimic response without giving the sergeant the satisfaction of a barked eye. After the third silent day, the manual's warmth didn't fade at dismissal. It lingered into sleep, carrying a new undertone that felt like someone quietly paging through a book one room over. The whispers weren't prophecies. They didn't say duck before a stray bolt tore foam from the range wall. They didn't whisper the names of recruits who would not be there at dawn. They said small things that made big things possible. Left again, stand, the kind of words page 1 had been practicing in our hands for weeks. Then one spoke in someone else's voice. Night, barracks, that hush again, the manual on my chest, the pulse courteous. I was almost under when a whisper arrived so close to the words I used to think that I flinched as if struck. Jonas, it said, my name, not on this world, not in this uniform, a name I had been before. It wasn't spoken with a mouth. It unfolded the way a letter does when you find it in your own handwriting and realize you don't remember writing it. I lay very still until the name leaked away like heat through a seam. In the morning the manual felt heavier. When I held it by the spine, the gravity of it pulled my wrist down a degree more than before. Maybe that was something you could weigh.
Maybe it was just the body learning to tell the truth about a thing it had decided to love. By the end of the week, the entire squad carried the manuals the way veterans did, two-handed, close to the heart. The instructors stopped correcting us because there was nothing to correct. In the parade ground's glare, if you watched the line of books across 60 chests, you could see the pages flex in the same micropulse, as if a breeze ran through the paper from left to right and back again. Left, right, left. The floodlights blinked the answer one heartbeat later. I told myself I would not ask the manual for anything. It would be too easy. But in the quiet between alarms, with the bunk above me a weight in the ceiling, and the tone sitting patiently in my wrists, I let one question form without words, the way you let water collect in cupped hands and see how much the skin will hold. The page warmed. The pulse slowed enough to make room for something else. No voice came. Just a pressure toward the map. I did not open it. I slept with the book on my chest and woke with the word forward lodged behind my teeth like a prayer I would be punished for saying. The next day, the sergeant announced a new exercise. No rifles, no helmets, manuals only. Formation, he said. No cadence. We formed. We moved without order. The manuals warmed on the turns. The floodlights answered the left, right, left with their polite blink. The gate with 3 locks and no keyholes sat at the edge of the yard like a question that already knew our answer. The pages did not say go. They did not need to. The voice in the paper had learned our bones, and our bones were already leaning.
It began with Orla breaking a rule that had already learned how to punish itself. Evening study. Barracks quiet except for the clack of lasgun bolts being racked and unracked in the next bay, and the soft rasp of cloth on metal. We were supposed to keep our manuals on page 1, hands flat, eyes forward, lips moving through the same 6 words until the mind forgot it had other sentences. Orla didn't. She sat cross-legged on her bunk with the book angled against her knees, head tilted as if listening to a distant conversation. The floodlights outside blinked, left, right, left across the window slats. When their after-image cleared, I realized I could see the page she was staring at, and it wasn't page 1. It was blank, not new paper blank. Blank like a scraped palimpsest, the sheen slightly different from the rest of the stock, as if something had been written and then convinced the page it had never been there. While I watched, a single line appeared at the top in neat regulation body text, the kind you see in old catechisms and weapon manuals. 22, 10, Bay 3. 2 casualties. Orla didn't flinch. She pressed her fingertips to the margin, as if feeling for heat, and the line thickened. Below it, letters formed with the slow certainty of frost growing on glass. Cause: catastrophic cell venting during routine unload. Routine unload was happening now. We could hear the rattle of spent packs being stacked in Bay 3, the half-laughed curses as someone dropped a clip on a toe. Orla's breath shortened. She looked at me without turning her head. "Don't," I mouthed. She licked her lips and the page wrote again. Names withheld. No thrill in it. No wickedness. Just an administrative decision. The manual's tone, so often a companionable pulse, wasn't present. The words wrote themselves in a silence that felt rehearsed. Across the aisle, Fex's manual warmed in his hands. He didn't look up. Veterans knew how to pretend they couldn't see your sins. The floodlights blinked once. The barracks seemed to inhale. At 22-8 a hiss skated along the floor from under the door. Cool air, scentless. Someone on the night staff adjusting pressure. Orla's page accepted the information and did nothing with it. At 22:10 exactly, a metallic cough rang from the next bay. Then a second, deeper, with a throat in it. No one moved. We had learned that attention is a currency you spend only when you intend to be changed by the purchase. Boots hit corridor. A medic's kit rattled. The murmurs were correct, measured, the kind that fit neatly into a line on a report. After a minute, the noises steadied the way they do when the outcome has removed uncertainty from the room. Orla's page wrote nothing else. The sergeant came through the barracks at 22:20 with eyes that had been told not to see. He walked the aisle, checked nothing, said nothing, left. Orla closed the manual with both hands. I saw her jaw work once, twice, like she was grinding a stone into a smaller stone. She didn't sleep, neither did I. In the morning, roll call was an act of faith. The clerk read the list in that same voice carved into his throat at induction. No names were skipped. No absent echoed. 2 places down from me, a bunk was made perfectly, manual centered on the pillow. Across the room, another. Present, the sergeant said into the air between them. At mess, the emptiness took trays that steamed and did not cool. At weapons issue, racks had 2 more rifles than hands to take them. The manuals in our bay warmed on the same beat when the quartermaster stacked those rifles in the back and slid the rack closed. Orla waited until after drill to open her book again. Not in the barracks, not under the eye of the instructors. In the latrine, 3rd stall from the door, the one with the bolt that always caught and needed a second lift from beneath. She perched on the seat, with boots squared on the concrete, and the manual resting on her thighs. I stood outside and watched the empty door as if guarding the throne of a saint. The blank page accepted her attention and wrote, 13, parade ground, 1 casualty. She swallowed. I put my palm on the door and felt sweat I didn't remember making. Cause heat collapse during discipline hold. Discipline hold, the standing still they loved most. We had endured hours in the square without a twitch. A man does not die of stillness in weather like ours. Temperate, the instructors called it, as if the atmosphere itself had been cautioned to behave. I wanted to laugh and could not. A pause. The manual waited. Then, as if adding a footnote, name Orla Quen. She exhaled a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a prayer. Her knuckles went white on the leather. The page did not change to comfort her. The letters sat, honest as weights. Close it, I said through the door. I was quieter than fear. Close it. She did. The manual warmed, heavy against her thighs, and the warmth did not feel like kindness. We went to the square at 12:55 with the rest, manuals on chests, page 1 like a medal we had not earned. The floodlights were off. The day had its own flat light, shadows drawn with a careful pencil. The drill master called hold, and we held. Minute 1. Knees fine. Minute 3. Ankles beginning the slow burn. Minute 5. The ache set in as a companion, pulled a chair up beside the soul and got comfortable. We had made a friend of pain, and named it training. It obliged us by wearing the mask we gave it. At 13, the square seemed to tilt a degree. The light did not change. The wind did not stir. The sensation was internal, the way sickness announces itself before a symptom. Orla's manual warmed. I knew it without looking. Her breath shortened, shallow and fast. Do not break, the drill master said, voice the width of a knife's edge. I turned my head the smallest illegal fraction. Orla stood 2 files over, eyes ahead, jaw set. Sweat pooled at the hollow of her throat and made a drop slow down her sternum. The drop reached the manual's edge and clung there, indecisive. Her shoulders wavered, and then remembered who they were supposed to be. The square held us all like a breath. At 13:4, Orla's knees refused their instructions. It wasn't a collapse, it was a denial. She folded slowly, as if someone had turned down gravity under her by degrees, and came to rest on the ferrocrete with her manual still pressed to her chest. The book did not fall, her eyes did not close, the instructors did not move. The floodlights unlit, managed somehow to look attentive. When the drill master finally spoke, he said a single word, witness. We did. We stood. We watched Orla sit with perfect posture on the square, hands flat on the book, breath small, eyes bright. A medic approached with the precise calm of a man who has trained for interventions he will not be permitted to make. He set his kit at her feet, and without opening it stood at parade rest. At 13:05, his kit was removed. At 13:07, Orla stood, her face empty, no relief, no shame. She stepped back into formation on the beat she had left, as if nothing had been removed or returned. When the dismissal came, the manuals pulsed in unison, left, right, left. We went to mess and chewed what they gave us, and pretended thresholds had not been crossed. That night, Orla came to my bunk with the manual hugged to her ribs. We went back to the 3rd latrine stall, like the devout sneaking to illicit sacrament. The page waited, blank and expectant, like a clerk with a pen poised. She opened to the same place and set her fingertips in the same margin. Letters formed with the inexorable patience of a machine that can think in days. The manual wrote 3 new entries before we had breath to read the first. 03, night watch,
1 casualty gate. Cause, transgression of threshold. The gate. The one with 3 locks and no keyholes. The one that never opened on night watch because the world ended at the floodlights and diplomacy had rules. Orla's hands shook. The book steadied them by existing. Name. Withheld. I wanted to vomit. There is nausea that comes from the gut, and there is nausea that comes from knowing a rule before it needs to be written. The page, polite as a librarian, added a 4th line, 0359, dismissal, all present. We didn't go to the instructors. No one goes to the people who taught you to be quiet when quiet is the hazard. We went to Fex. He listened. He did not blink. He set his manual on the windowsill and leaned both palms on it like a man bracing a bridge. This is not prophecy, he said. It is rehearsal. The page is writing what the base has decided to do. Then we can change it, Orla said. The hope in her voice felt like a small warm animal. You lay in the road and wait to see whether traffic will remember to be kind. Fex tilted his head. The floodlights blinked left, right, left, and the manuals answered with that tiny, contented pulse. No, he said, but we can learn our marks. Adult 3, the siren woke us into the square. Floodlights opened like eyes. The fence sat where it always sat now, farther out in the dark. The gate with the 3 blind locks stood at attention. We took our places. The drill master's voice carried without needing to be loud. Stand. Witness. Adult 327. The time my wrist had learned to fear without numerals. Someone in the far file shifted a shoe a centimeter. Nothing more. Over the paint line of the grid. Maybe it was an itch. Maybe it was a test. Maybe they had read a page that said their name and decided to write a different one. The manuals warmed in unison. Not comfort. Warning. I felt the heat through cloth on my sternum like a hand. The gate did not open. It did something worse. It accepted. The line of the fence hiccuped, like a snake adjusting its jaw, and swallowed the centimeter of shoe as if that space had always belonged on the other side. The recruit hissed, a short, startled intake. The dark leaned 1 degree. The floodlights did not brighten. No scream, no struggle. The square erased the error the way a body erases a bruise, cell by quiet cell, until you could swear the skin had never known the wrong lesson. We stood. We counted breaths. We pretended not to count. At 0459, the siren chirped, and the manuals cooled. Roll call at 0530, named the recruit present. The bunk was perfect. Orla didn't open the manual again for 2 days. When she did, the page wrote on its own before she touched it. 1640, range, 3 casualties, no targets. Cause, overheat during empty fire. Names, withheld. We marched to the range at 16-4, with rifles that would sweat heat without touching metal, and manuals that would refuse to announce any word but forward. The target rails were bare. The sergeant said nothing. We took our lanes and fired into an empty field until the smell of hot plastic and ozone made the tongue forget food. When I checked my counter, it still read full. At 1640, a last pack vented in lane 7, like a side-turned knife. Then another, then a third. The medics moved like chess pieces. The manuals warmed like hands remembering a bargain. Back at barracks, Orla pressed her page until her fingertips blanched and asked a question without speaking. The book refused to answer. The line it wrote instead was the smallest the manual had ever offered, like a whisper under a door. 1940. Parade. None. A kindness. A reprieve. Or a reminder that the page wasn't writing for us. It was writing for itself, and we were allowed to watch. I told myself, as I lay with the manual on my chest, and the tone curling in my wrists, that if I could see a prediction, I could avoid it. That I could stop my feet at the threshold of the square, or step back from a venting pack, or keep a heel from crossing paint. The page did not agree or disagree. It wrote what it wrote, and then lay silent while the base followed suit. The next morning, the map in the manual showed a line that did not exist in the corridors. It ran from the barracks to the outer wall, then beyond, a neat arrow into pale blank. No labels, no distances, just one word in the margin, written in the same neat hand as the casualty lines, as calmly as a clerk signing for delivery. Forward.
We assembled on the parade ground just before second dusk, floodlights off, wind asleep, manuals pressed to chests. Page 1 outward. We formed 2 concentric squares and waited for cadence. It didn't come. The sergeant stepped to the center mark, hands behind his back, eyes on the ground as if a line were about to be written there. Exercise begins, he said, voice even, and stepped away. He did not say which exercise. He did not say when. We waited for the second word, the one that always follows the first. But silence is a language here. We stood. We breathed. The square breathed back. 5 minutes. 10. Time sliding across muscle and bone. The manual warmed in its slow animal way. A degree, another pressing into sternum, convincing rib and lung it had always been there. Somewhere a relay clicked. Hold, a drill master murmured to the air, and the air agreed that we already were. Veterans eased to their heels and let the ache drain. The rest of us learned late and paid interest. An hour poured into us. Knees were pulleys told to be pillars. Spine remembered night watch. Across the file, Orla held her manual higher than regulation, the page against her throat as if listening from both sides. Our eyes met for a fraction of a wrong moment. She didn't shake her head. She didn't need to. No page had written an end. At the edge of vision, the fence accepted a new post like the sea accepts a stone. It hadn't been there an hour ago. Now it was old. The triple locks on the gate gleamed, blind and satisfied. The floodlights blinked and stayed dark. After the second hour, the first fell. He softened, as if discipline had been poured out with heat. His manual stayed on his chest like a seal. No one caught him. Orders are for the living, and the manual had already told us what we were. A medic came, checked the jaw, nodded, and walked off without opening his kit. Nothing else changed. The second fall came faster. A whisper slid. Cloth on cloth, not gossip, and even that stopped. The exercise accepted a shape. We learned to swallow while standing, a delicate choreography that keeps breath from choking and the jaw from trembling. Page 1 warmed and cooled in a slow tide. The baseline ratcheted upward each time it ebbed. The sky forgot evening and turned the grey of unused paper. Shadows shortened to nothing, then lengthened the wrong way, pointing into the square instead of out. Floodlight housings clicked as metal contracted. They did not ignite. We stood. The instructors did not pace or correct. They stood at the corners like 4 stitches and watched the thread. I measured time by tiny licenses. Every 100 breaths shift weight. Every 300 let the jaw unclench and reclench. The manual helped. A pulse if I moved too soon. A lull when I should not move at all. The book and I negotiated a truce between endurance and collapse. By the 4th hour, the square smelled of copper in the throat. Sweat mapped skin and remapped it. Someone retched without bending. A thread of spit hung to page 1 and trembled there for 5 breaths before he drew it back and learned a new kind of shame. In the 5th, a recruit on the outer ring tried to end the exercise by ending the rule. He lifted his manual, turned one page as neat as a ritual, and stared down. The book did not scream. The air did. Temperature fell like a door opening onto winter. He froze like the first silence. Color returned to him 1 pixel at a time. He did not turn the page back. He did not fall. He simply learned how to be colder. By the 6th, sound narrowed into a tunnel. Footsteps beyond the yard were the only music. The manual's low tone blurred into blood. The gate learned a new angle. A degree of open that wasn't open. Permission refused but memorized. The lock stayed blind. The 7th hour gave rain that didn't fall. It condensed on shoulders and lashes, beading into even drops. We were the stave. The drops vanished without rolling or soaking, leaving only a remembered coolness we were meant to interpret as mercy. Near midnight, the floodlights snapped on. No hum, no warm-up, black to white. Shadows slammed into place as if nailed. Sudden clarity made it worse. There is kindness in not seeing the edges of your asking. Under the white cones I counted, who still stood and knew that dawn would halve us. Not from malice, from math. Between midnight and the hour with no name, the sergeant moved. 3 steps, turned to the gate. Manual lifted like a ward, a small bow to a superior you pretend is an equal. The dark at the fence leaned a degree toward him and back. He returned to the center and folded his hands. Veterans began a shared sway, a micro-movement that never took a heel off paint. The rest of us copied without knowing. A recruit 2 files down smiled, like recognizing a song through a wall. First gray touched from the east like a hand checking a fever. Dawn here is not light, it is permission to count. The floodlights clicked off a fraction before the sky decided it could see. In the gentler shade, men began to sit or lie in tidy silence, 1 every half minute. Manuals landed on ribs and stayed. A medic tidied a sleeve here, a collar there.
the smallest courtesies offered to bodies that had remembered their job title. By sunrise, the square held half. The drill masters did not call halt. The exercise ended the way all things here end, by deciding it had always intended to stop now. "Dismiss," the sergeant said. The word carried the same weight as present at roll call, a statement, not an invitation. The manuals called a degree, then held. We filed past those who sat or lay where they had accepted the lesson. No one looked down. Looking is a currency. In the barracks, roll named every man. Present. The clerk's voice did not care what we had tallied. Bunks were made. The absent folded into perfection by unseen hands. Trays steamed. Orla came to my bunk between dismissal and mess, with her manual open to the page that writes itself. It had recorded nothing during the night. No times, no causes, no names. At the bottom margin, where amendments would go in a real book, a single word had been added in the same neat hand. Observed. She traced the letters without touching and said, not a whisper and not a voice. Why teach us to watch if watching cannot change it? Because the manual wants witnesses more than survivors. I didn't say it. I closed her book with 2 fingers and slid it back. Night watch, I said, though it was day. Sleep if you can. Later, when the map would erase the barracks and negate the need for locks, the drill with no end would sit in us like an organ we hadn't realized we'd grown. It would pump when nothing else would. It would remind Bone how to stand in the silence between orders and pretend endurance is a plan. That afternoon, the floodlights blinked at an empty square. No one saw it but me. The manuals warmed, very faint, as if agreeing with a joke the base had made to itself. Exercise begins, the sergeant had said, and never said stop. The manual did not need him to.
The barracks had never been home, but it had always been a map in my head. 6 rooms in sequence, corridor running straight like a rifle barrel, latrine at one end, mess hall at the other, fixed points to anchor the days between drills. That morning, after the drill with no end, I walked to the latrine and found the door gone. The corridor didn't end, it turned. No one spoke about it at first. Everyone walked the new corner as if it had always been there, as if the right angle had been drawn into our memory along with the smell of soap and metal. Even the veterans didn't pause, didn't frown, but the manuals had already decided. When I opened mine on instinct, the map was there, corridors in red ink lines, doors marked with neat Gothic script. The latrine was still at the end, but the corridor between us and it was now bent like an elbow. And there was something else. 2 new rooms marked in gold, labeled Dormitory 7 and Storage Omega. I had never heard those names. I had never seen those doors. Omega's icon was a circle broken at the top, not a letter. I knew enough Mechanicus symbology to know it meant sealed or incomplete. I closed the manual. When I opened it again, the 2 rooms were still there. That was the first night. The second night, the bunks moved. We slept in tight rows, steel frames bolted to the floor. You could reach out and touch the boot polish under the next man's bunk without standing up. But in the morning, the rows were staggered, creating narrow aisles where there had been solid lines, and the bolt holes in the floor, sealed flush, painted over. The manuals didn't just record the change, they had anticipated it. When I flipped to the map, the new arrangement was already there, dated 2 days prior, as if someone had updated the plans before the hammers swung. Orla came to my side while we dressed for mess. She didn't speak, just held her manual open so I could see the date stamp, same as mine, same as everyone's, I suspected. The manual had decided on the change before the night it happened. The base had simply obeyed. By the 3rd night, the strangeness stopped being subtle. We woke to find the central corridor had forked like a wishbone, each branch ending in a door painted black with no handle. The paint gleamed, still tacky, though none of us had seen workers or smelled the chemical stink that clung to fresh coats. The manuals updated again, but the black doors were labeled differently for different recruits. Mine read Range 3 and Dormitory 8. Orla's showed Archive Delta and Medicae Sub-Level 2. A 3rd recruit swore his said Mess Hall twice. The actual mess hall was unchanged, still at the far end of the old path, but the old path didn't exist anymore. You had to take the left fork, then a winding hall that looped twice around itself before opening into the familiar smell of broth and bread. The veterans didn't blink. They filed into the loops and the new mess route like they'd been walking it for years. By the end of the week, I stopped trusting the walls. The barracks became a rotating puzzle. Every night something moved. A doorway shifted, a wall bowed inward, a stairwell disappeared into blank paneling. We learned to sleep light, boots laced, manual on chest, in case the path to the latrine became a maze or the way to the mess turned into a dead end. And the manual wasn't just following the changes, it was leading them. 3 nights in a row, it showed me storage Omega in gold, pulsing faintly. But no matter how many corridors changed, no matter how many new rooms slid into place, Omega never appeared in reality. It became a private itch. I traced my finger along the red and gold lines in the manual, memorizing the route the book insisted existed, right from the bunks, past dormitory 7, down an angled corridor with 5 steps up, then a left turn into Omega. When I tried to follow it in reality, I reached a wall, smooth, painted, unbroken. I stood there in the dim corridor, watching the wall for movement. Behind it, I imagined the room exactly as the manual had drawn it. Empty shelves, cold air, something sealed inside. The others started to notice different discrepancies. A recruit from dormitory 3 swore his map showed my bunk room as a blank white square. Orla's manual removed the latrine entirely, replacing it with something called restoration cell. We compared maps one night, huddled in the mess after lights out. Every one of us had a different plan of the same building. Some rooms were doubled, some erased. Only the veterans refused to look. When we asked one of them, thin grey at the temples, manual so worn the spine was cloth, he said, "Maps are for the living." Then he closed his book and left. On the 7th night, the manual betrayed me. I woke to the sound of footsteps, heavy but unhurried, passing my bunk. I reached for my map, flipped to the current layout. It showed a straight hall from my room to the mess. No branches, no doors. But when I stepped into the corridor, there was a new junction. Both branches led into black painted doors, the same glossy handleless surface as before, and my manual didn't show them. Not blank space, not erased, just a continuation of the hall, as if the doors didn't exist. That was worse than the gold-marked rooms. Those had at least been acknowledged. It was warm. By morning, the junction was gone. The hall was straight again. The manuals had not changed. In the mess, no one mentioned it, but I saw the same stiffness in Orla's shoulders, the same hollow set in the eyes of the recruit across from me. We didn't speak. Words could make it real. Words could make it stay. The night after that, the manual gave me something new, a flashing red symbol over my own bunk room. I traced it with my finger and felt the faintest hum through the page, like the vibration of distant machinery. When I looked up, the wall at the far end of the room was moving, not shifting like before, not swapping doors or bending corridors, breathing, expanding, and contracting in slow, deliberate rhythm. The manual stayed open in half the bunks. No one turned the page. The barracks were perfect again, and for the first time, I realized the manual's perfection was the most dangerous thing in the building. It didn't matter what moved in the night. It didn't matter how many rooms vanished or appeared. The map was never wrong because the building was becoming the map, not the other way around. We used to joke quietly, the way men spend breath they can't afford, that the instructors were carved out of the same plasteel as the bunks. It was a barracks myth, with rounded corners, something you can put in your mouth without cutting it. After the barracks began to rewrite itself, the myth stopped being funny. It started being accurate. The first change was barely a change at all. Light. Their eyes began to answer light like polished stone, not like wet living tissue. In the bruise-red corridor lumens at Docker 3's, their pupils didn't swallow the glow, they reflected it. Tiny coins under glass. On the parade ground, when the floodlights woke the square into white, something flat lived where depth should be. When an instructor's head turned, the reflection slid across the surface with no catch. It was like watching a window decide which world to belong to. Orla noticed first. She had a gift for looking straight at wrongness without flinching. "They're mirrors," she said under her breath, as we filed past a drill master by the mess hatch. Not eyes, mirrors. Don't, I said. The word had become more prayer than warning. The second change was in their speaking. Orders always came crisp, a relief valve for tension you've been told to call discipline. But a new layer slipped under the crack, a tone we felt before we heard it. At first I thought it was the manuals answering, that familiar pulse slipping into the mouth of command. Then it happened when our books were locked in racks during weapons clean. The sergeant called hold, and 3 other voices, the drill masters at the corners, finished the word with him. Not echo, not relay, unison. An echo tells you the shape of the room. Unison tells you the shape of the speakers. 4 mouths, 1 syllable, no delay. The skin between my shoulder blades tightened the way it does when cold goes through bone. Veterans didn't react. The manuals warmed a degree, and then held as if someone had laid a calm hand across their spines. It kept happening during very specific moments. Hold, forward, witness, present. Short words learned in pit drills and on meat. Always on words that fence off thoughts. When the sergeant said left, the others didn't join him. When he said with, the air stayed single. There was pattern to their chorus, and the pattern wasn't for us. The third change came with smell. We learned the base's odors the way children learn weather. Disinfectant sting, the mineral sweetness of the water main, hot plastic from the range, the dust's burnt metal tang. Now a new scent snuck in and made a home. Machine oil cut with the faint medicinal bite of antiseptic. It was most present in narrow places, and strongest where the instructors stood for too long. The scent didn't cling to cloth. It settled into the seams of things, the joint between door and wall, the crease at the base of a stair. It made the air taste like you'd licked a coin. The fourth change we only admitted after someone else said it first. "Do you hear that?" a recruit whispered during boot polish, bent over his work like prayer. I strained. The barracks breathed its usual breaths. Then under it, a sound like a small clock set inside a pillow. Click, whir, settle. Quiet enough to deny if you wanted to, persistent enough to learn to hate. We called it gears to have a name, but gears are loud, self-confident, vulgar. This had manners. The sound came strongest when an instructor passed close, strongest still when 2 stood shoulder to shoulder. If 3 of them stood together as they began to, more and more, the clicks fell into a simple pattern, left, right, left. The floodlights out on the square sometimes blinked the same rhythm a second later, as if the towers were nodding hello to their kin. By then the barracks map had entered its liar phase. The manual drew rooms that weren't, and refused rooms that were. The building accepted correction with a shrug. The instructors started appearing in places that made the map more wrong. You'd turn a corner that didn't exist yesterday, and there they'd be, 2 in profile, 1 facing you, eyes reflecting lumen strips as if the corridor had no other content. They never blocked a doorway. They never hurried. They arrived at your periphery, and then asked the room to make sense of them. We learned to keep our manuals against the sternum when they were near. The pulse that had been a friend became a semaphore. Hold, don't speak, heard. The book knew them the way a dog knows weather. 3 things happened on the same day, and taught us we had crossed a line that had been chalk for weeks. Morning drill, formation work in the yard with no cadence. We moved by manual heat and habit. The sergeant stood at the center, hands behind his back, glass eyes cutting the sunlight into hard coins. "Witness," he said, and the other 3 matched him on the second syllable, a chord no throat should make, one voice shaved into 4 edges and set back together. The manuals warmed sharply, then cooled. He turned his head, not far, just a quarter turn to the gate, and something in the skin along his jaw didn't quite remember how to fold. A crease opened, closed, opened again, like a seam testing a new stitch. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw oil crawl along the line and vanish into hair. No one coughed, no one pretended not to stare. Staring would have been a lie, and we had been taught to save lies for when they work. Afternoon range, no targets again. The rails slid empty across the dirt, squealing occasionally to remind us they existed. We fired into field and heat, counters that lied, barrels that didn't. Half an hour in, a drill master walked the back line between us and said nothing. He stopped exactly behind Orla. The click under his coat synchronized with my pulse,
then took control of it. My shots landed closer. Orla's stance improved by degrees, as if someone were making micro-adjustments along her spine with a wrench too delicate to see. When he moved on, her breath stuttered. She did not turn her head. Later she would say she hadn't seen him come or go. She had only felt her bones inherit a purpose not their own. Evening mess. The instructors didn't eat with us. They never had. This time they entered the hall in a line that made the room decide how wide it was. They walked past tray line, past tables, past the old saint's print someone had taped crooked above the urns. Their eyes cut the lumen reflections into neat rectangles and laid them down on the floor one after another like cards. When they reached the far wall, they stopped. The quiet was the kind that follows a prayer no one agreed to say. All present, the sergeant said without looking at the clerk. The clerk wrote a line on a slate that already had the line written. Somewhere beyond the mess hatch, something in the building's bones answered with a small satisfied creak, the sound wood makes when it remembers it is tree. That night, the corridor turned again. Not just at a new angle, a fold. You could walk straight, count 20 paces, and be back at your door without turning. The manual pretended the hall was still honest. The black door I had touched 2 nights ago, warm paint, no handle, appeared in the fold. Standing inside the bend were 2 instructors, facing inward, eyes coin flat. If you moved, they did not. If you stopped, their reflections changed shape as if acknowledging your decision. We stood there, me and Orla, and a veteran, whose manual spine had become frayed cloth, and listened. The gears that aren't clicked 3 beats, rested 1, clicked 2. The floodlights outside flicked left right left on a delay we had learned to count without counting. The veteran whispered, "They are keeping time for the building." He didn't sound afraid, he sounded relieved. Relief here is the last luxury. "What are they?" Orla asked, not to me, not to him, to the door, to the fold, to the manual humming against her sternum like a heart that had read ahead. "They are what we'll be if we do this right," the veteran said. He stroked the cloth spine with a thumb. "They speak together because they were taught to finish each other's words. We will be taught the same. The base is a throat. We are teaching it to say forward without coughing." I understood him and hated the understanding. It made sense, with the kind of sense that makes men into machines politely, to spare the machine the insult of force. The manual warmed a fraction, as if pleased my mind had taken the path it wanted, like water finding the groove. The next morning, an instructor broke. Not a collapse, a malfunction learned to be graceful. During weapons inspection, he raised his hand to demonstrate a safety he had demonstrated 100 times. The hand did not stop where it should. The wrist rotated 1 degree too far, and kept going until the skin said no more, and the joint said "I don't care." We heard the soft internal sound of decision, click, settle, and then saw something like a vein fumbling to find where to live. The instructor paused. His glass eyes did not change. The manual in my hands became warm enough to sting. He rotated the wrist back by increments, each with that pillow clock click, until bone and pretense met on a compromise. He finished the demonstration with fingers that remembered their role. No one commented. The sergeant did not nod. The floodlights did not blink. The building smelled, for a heartbeat, purely of antiseptic and oil. Then the air remembered coin metal, and broth and dust, and the moment folded into the routine we'd learned to carry like a bowl. From then on, the unison orders multiplied. Hold forward, witness, present, sometimes dismiss. And when they said it together, the manuals cooled exactly 1 degree everywhere on the square at once. The click under their coats kept time with our pulses, until our pulses learned to follow without supervision. During night watch, the instructors began to stand inside the square, not at the edges, 4 figures, coin-eyed, hands behind backs, facing outward like new floodlight towers that had traded electricity for will. The dark beyond the fence leaned in, leaned out, learned the new border. The manuals grew heavier, the maps grew stranger. The base learned to say forward without someone writing the word first. We stopped telling ourselves the instructors were carved from plasteel. The myth had been too kind. Plasteel has the courtesy to be one thing. The drill masters were a text being edited while we watched. The edit bled backward into earlier lines, and insisted it had always read this way. When the ambush came in the wastes, men in our insignia, marching with our posture, manuals pressed to chests, we would recognize the unison before the first shot. We would hear the hidden clock in their steps. We would understand too late to use the understanding.
that the base hadn't only been training us to obey, it had been rehearsing how to speak in our voices.
The march to the range started like every other live fire drill, boots in rhythm, manuals pressed against chests, barrels angled down to avoid accidental discharge. The instructors walked alongside us without speaking, eyes catching the early light and throwing it back in cold rectangles. The manual against my chest had been warm since morning muster, a steady low heat like a coal banked under ash. At first I thought nothing of the absence. You don't notice the absence of birds until you remember birds live here. You don't notice the absence of wind until your ears strain for it. And you don't notice the absence of the target silhouettes until you've walked the firing lane halfway and the horizon is just dirt and heat haze. The range was the same length, the same sun-baked expanse, same lines cut into the dirt by decades of boots, same metal rails where servitors used to carry out wooden cutouts painted with enemy profiles. Except the rails were empty, no shapes, no markers, just a long, unbroken nothing. We filed into position without comment, rifles coming up on the sergeant's silent hand signal. My eyes tried to invent shapes at the far end of the range, shadows that might be silhouettes. Heat shimmer erased them before they could settle into reality. Fire. One word, one voice, 4 instructors in unison, though only one moved his mouth. The first volley cracked through the morning stillness. The reports rolled down range, looking for something to hit, something to tell us this was worth doing. Dust rose in small puffs, dozens of meters short of where targets should have been. We waited for the cease. It didn't come. The manuals grew warmer. Fire. The same word again. Same chorus. We obeyed. Rounds streaked into emptiness, chewing at dirt that gave nothing back. I adjusted my aim, raising it higher, thinking perhaps the absence was part of the drill, a lesson in marksmanship against the invisible. The manuals throbbed faintly, as if approving the thought. The sun climbed. Our barrels began to heat. No order to stop. No order to reload. The dirt at the far end began to look different, darker, churned, though I never saw any projectile land there. I fired until the air around my rifle's muzzle shimmered, and the handguard seared my palm through the glove. Still, no one reloaded. I risked glancing at my ammo counter. Full. Not nearly full. Not misreading under glare. Completely, immovably full. Every round I'd fired, every kick, every casing, apparently had never happened. The heat in my hands told me otherwise. Across the line, Orla was firing in measured bursts, her face blank. The recruit 2 stations over was squeezing the trigger in a steady rhythm, each shot accompanied by a sharp inhale like the click of a metronome. No one hesitated. No one questioned. The manuals had become heavy enough to feel like weights against our ribs. The sound of firing began to change. It lost the ragged stagger of human rhythm. A synchrony grew between us without command, our triggers aligning like parts in a machine. The instructors didn't pace now. They stood behind us, hands clasped, faces silvered by light from no clear source. Somewhere between volleys, I realized the range didn't sound like a range anymore. The echoes didn't behave. They didn't bounce back from the berm. They didn't die into the sky. They went forward, always forward, as if the rounds were punching through distance and finding more distance on the other side. We fired until the air tasted metallic, until the heat from the barrels was a shared atmosphere. My weapon's handguard smoked. The recruit to my left had burn marks up his forearm, where the metal had kissed skin. He didn't flinch. I looked at my counter again. Full. The manuals grew hotter. I could feel a faint vibration in mine, like the purr of a machine at idle. I pressed my thumb into the cover and it pressed back. Not literally, but enough for my nerves to believe it. No one reloaded. No one stopped firing. The instructors stepped closer, their boots leaving no mark in the dirt. They leaned in, heads tilting in eerie synchrony, eyes still catching that invisible silver. I couldn't tell if they were watching us, or the invisible thing in the distance. It was Orla who stopped first, not out of disobedience, out of shock. She'd looked at her counter, looked at her rifle, then without warning, dropped the weapon to low ready and turned toward the sergeant. "What are we?" she began. The manual against her chest flipped a page on its own. I didn't see the words, I only heard the sound, a dry, deliberate turn that cut cleanly through the thunder of gunfire. Her eyes locked on whatever the page said. Her lips moved like she was counting something. Then she picked up the rifle and joined the rhythm without another word. We fired until the sun was high, until the barrels were dangerously close to warping, until the ground under our boots seemed to hum with the same impossible frequency as the manuals. Then, without signal, the instructors turned and walked away. We stopped firing only when the heat in our weapons threatened to peel the skin from our hands. The range fell silent, except for the quiet hiss of cooling metal. When the last echo bled out into the haze, I saw movement at the far end of the range, not figures, not targets, just the dirt folding inward, like a mouth closing. When it was gone, the ground was smooth, untouched, as if we had never fired a single round. Our ammo counters still read full, the manuals cooled in unison. And then, as if rewarding a lesson learned without asking, all of them, every single book turned one page at exactly the same moment. It started as a whisper, the kind you'd dismiss as wind through vents, or the faint ring in your ears after the range. But this wasn't in my ears, it was in the manual. We just returned from the firing yard, weapons racked, barrels cooling in their slots. The manuals were back in our bunks, resting exactly where we'd left them before drill, though none of us remembered actually leaving them there. They always seemed to be waiting. That night, something was wrong with Yaren's. He was sitting on the edge of his bunk, staring at the closed cover, lips pressed tight. The rest of us pretended not to notice. Pretending not to notice was one of the first unspoken skills you learned here. When lights out came, the whispering started. It was soft at first, a faint thread of sound winding out of Yaren's bunk. I strained to make out words, but the syllables were wrong, sharp angles and liquid slides, like they'd been designed for a throat that wasn't human. Yaren didn't sleep. His eyes stayed open in the dim red of the barracks lamps, fixed on the manual as if he were daring it to move. The whispering swelled, weaving under the rhythm of our breathing, until it was the only sound in the room. Then, without warning, it screamed. It wasn't loud in the way you think of sound. It was loud inside. The noise came from the back of the skull, shoving outward, scraping at bone like claws. My hands clamped to my ears, but it made no difference. The sound wasn't coming through them. Half the recruits flinched. The other half didn't move at all, like they couldn't hear it. Yaren clutched the manual, knuckles white, trying to keep it closed. The scream rose, unbroken, a blade of noise vibrating in marrow. My stomach turned over. Then the book opened on its own. The pages fanned, then slammed shut on one in the middle. My bunk was far enough that I couldn't see the words, only that they moved, not flipped, not scrolling, moved like ink becoming liquid and reshaping itself into something new. Yaren's eyes locked to the page. The scream cut off, replaced by an awful silence, the kind that makes your body brace for impact. The lights flickered. I couldn't look away, not from the way his jaw went slack, then clenched, then slack again, as if words were trying to climb out but couldn't make it past his teeth. The instructors didn't come. No alarm sounded. This was happening, and the base had decided it wasn't a problem worth acknowledging. The silence lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then the screaming returned, not from the book this time, but from Yaren. It was the same sound, exactly the same. One moment it was a mechanical, alien shriek. The next it was human lungs forcing it out, shredding vocal cords to match a noise that should have been impossible. His bunkmates didn't move. The ones nearest him stared straight ahead, eyes glassy, as if trained to ignore him the way you ignore pain drills. The rest of us froze, every muscle locked by that sound. Then Yaren stopped. His breathing slowed, his eyes shut, and that was it. Lights out continued as normal. No one checked on him. No medics were called. In the morning, his bunk was empty. Not messy, not abandoned. Empty in the way it was when we first arrived. Sheets tight, pillow undented, no personal effects. Roll call came. When the sergeant reached his name, there was no pause, no question, just the same flat response we'd heard for everyone else. Present. We didn't see Yaren again. His manual was gone too. Except Later that day, during kit inspection, I found one on my bunk. It wasn't mine. Mine was still tucked under my bedroll, exactly where I'd left it. This one was colder, lighter, and the edges of its pages looked damp, as if they'd been left out in the mist. When I opened it, the first page wasn't the familiar 6 words. It was blank. I flipped forward, blank, 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 until the middle, where the paper stuck slightly. I pulled it apart, and there it was, a page so black, the letters looked like holes, and I didn't recognize the language, but I recognized the shape of the sound it wanted to make. I closed it before it could. That night, I locked both manuals under my bunk. I still heard one of them whispering. Morning came without a bugle. Instead, it was the manuals that woke us. Not with words, not with sound, but with motion. Each one was already open on its owner's bunk, turned to a fresh page that no one remembered flipping to. The paper didn't lie flat. It pulled, ever so slightly, as if something beneath it was drawing toward the floor. The text was red, not printed, wet. Lines formed slowly, one letter at a time, in neat military perfect script. Advance. That was it. No coordinates, no mission type, no briefing. Just that single word, filling the entire page like a proclamation. I glanced at the others. Some recruits were already lacing their boots, faces blank, eyes fixed on nothing. Others just stared at the order, knuckles whitening around the manual's cover. The instructors arrived, silent as ever. No whistles, no shouted commands. They just stood in the doorway, glassy-eyed, until we filed out of the barracks. Outside, the sky was the pale, washed-out color of steel. No sun, just light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The parade ground was empty, except for us. Then I saw it. At the far edge of the compound, where the outer gates usually loomed shut, the blast doors were open. Beyond them stretched the wasteland, cracked soil, wind-scoured rock, and a horizon so flat it made you feel like you could fall off it. The manuals didn't give us a route, didn't need to. Every time I hesitated, the page in mine shifted, the letters blurred, then reformed sharper than before, the ink seeming to swell with impatience. Advance. We crossed the threshold into the wasteland without a word from the instructors. No one questioned why we weren't in transports, why we had no visible supply units. There was nothing to mark the path except the manuals in our hands, each one glowing faintly at the page edges, visible even in the daylight. We walked. Hours passed. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint metallic scent that stuck to the back of the throat. The ground underfoot grew softer, pocked with shallow depressions like something had been burrowing or marching in perfect formation years before. By midday, my boots were caked in dust so fine it felt oily. Every breath tasted of iron. The manuals flipped their own pages. No hands touched them, but the parchment moved in unison, every soldier's book turning to the same sequence of diagrams, troop formations, fire lanes, kill zones. Only the kill zones weren't terrain maps. They were shapes, human silhouettes, each one marked with names I didn't recognize. Yet some of the recruits stiffened at them, recognition in their eyes. I risked a glance at mine. The silhouette on my page had my height, my posture, even the angle of my rifle sling. No name was printed beneath it, just present. The red text bled slightly into the paper. We reached a ridge as the light began to fade. Beyond it, the land dipped into a shallow basin, too flat, too symmetrical to be natural. The manuals flipped again, showing a top-down schematic of the basin, every position marked with a small black dot. Our dots. The moment we crested the ridge, my stomach dropped. The basin was already full. Rows of PDF soldiers stood in perfect stillness, manuals open in their hands, pages glowing faintly in the twilight. Their uniforms were regulation, their insignia matched ours exactly, but their faces were wrong. Eyes too dark, as if filled to the brim with shadow. Skin too still, like mannequins given the ability to breathe but not to live. One by one, their manuals turned toward us. The red text inside them flared brighter, illuminating their features in a sickly light. Our own manuals responded. I felt mine grow heavier, the page tugging my arm toward the formation below. Then the words shifted. Advance became join. The recruits in front of me started down the slope without hesitation, rifles slung, movements smooth and mechanical. The basin's occupants made room, never breaking their stare. I backed up a step. The manual heated in my grip, the red ink bleeding faster, letters smearing but never losing shape. My fingers tingled, then went numb. Behind me, an instructor's voice, low, almost kind. "Forward, soldier." I turned. His eyes reflected the fading light like two flat mirrors. No pupils, no life. I looked past him. The gates to the base, the ones we'd marched through this morning, were shut. The page in my manual flipped on its own again. This time there was no word, just an empty square of white surrounded by black. A space, a placeholder. For me, the wind shifted. Down in the basin, the rows of soldiers raised their manuals in perfect unison, holding them out as if in offering. The air was so still I could hear the faint sound of pages turning, hundreds of them, all at once. And then, in the middle of that awful silence, every manual closed. Mine too. The red ink was gone. In its place, stamped deep enough into the cover to leave grooves in the leather, page 50. The basin was quiet when we reached the center. Too quiet. Not the absence of noise you find in a natural silence, but the kind of stillness that feels placed, as if someone had gone through and erased all sound. The other soldiers, the ones we'd seen from the ridge, stood only a few feet away now. I could see the stitching on their uniforms, the faint scratches on their armor plates. They were us. The same cut, the same bearing. The only difference was their eyes. Black, glossy, reflecting us back like a void. My manual opened on its own. No text this time, just a list of names. I scanned down the column, and my breath caught when I saw the first one, Varric Geno. He was standing 3 paces in front of me, manual clutched to his chest, head tilted in that slight, mechanical way the instructors sometimes did. The name beneath his was Yaren Cowell. She was there too, 2 places over, the girl who'd shared ration biscuits with me during our second week. Her smile was gone. Every recruit's manual was doing the same. Pages filled with names, ranks, and in some cases short notes. Marksmanship commendation, disciplinary infraction, status present. I had barely finished the page when the manuals flipped again. New heading, targets. The first shot rang out from somewhere behind me. A burst of Lars fire snapped overhead, its light briefly painting the black-eyed faces in front of us. The formation across from us responded instantly. Rifles up, muzzles spitting red. Chaos erupted. I dropped behind a slight rise in the ground as shots cracked and hissed around me. Someone screamed, high, short, cut off midway. I didn't look to see who. The manuals weren't passive anymore. Mine was flipping so violently it was hard to hold on to, the pages slapping against my hands. Every time it landed, it showed another name, another target. I risked a glance over the rise and froze. The targets weren't random. The names on my page were my squad mates, alive ones. The manual wanted me to fire on them. 2 meters to my left, a recruit named Hallen was standing exposed, firing into the formation ahead. His manual hung open at his belt, pages rippling in the wind. I saw my name flash across it. He turned toward me. I didn't think. I dove sideways as his laser round scorched the dirt where I'd been crouching. My own rifle came up without conscious thought. The manuals weren't just predicting anymore, they were ordering. In the flicker of muzzle flashes, I saw other recruits turning on each other, their expressions as blank as the basin soldiers. No shouting, no anger, just silent, perfect execution of whatever the red script told them. I tried to tear a page out of my manual. The paper wouldn't rip. My fingers slid over it like it was slick glass. The ink shimmered faintly as if amused by the attempt. The enemy formation advanced with machine precision, closing the distance in synchronized steps. The sound of boots on hardpan echoed unnaturally, the same sharp report repeated dozens of times, perfectly in sync. Someone grabbed my arm and hauled me back. It was Caro, one of the few left whose eyes still looked human. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, his rifle empty. There not he started, but was cut off by a last round that took him in the chest. He dropped instantly, manual sliding from his grasp. It landed open at my feet. Status: present. Next action: absorb. The basin tilted in my vision. I realized the ground wasn't steady anymore. It was vibrating in a slow, rhythmic pulse. Not from the last fire, from beneath us. Something was moving underground. The manuals all flipped at once, as if caught in the same gust of wind. Red script bloomed on the page. Engage. The order was redundant. Half the recruits still standing were already in hand-to-hand combat, rifles abandoned for bayonets or sheer force. The basin soldiers fought without emotion, without wasted motion. They didn't tire. I backed away from the melee, trying to reach the slope we'd come down. 2 steps in, I collided with someone, an instructor. His glassy eyes caught the dim light, his expression unchanging. He extended my manual toward me like an offering. The page inside was blank for a moment, then filled with a single line: survive until page turn. The world constricted to the sound of last fire and the thud of bodies hitting dirt. I glanced down at the page again, and a number appeared in the corner. 9. It ticked down slowly. 8. 7. Every second felt stretched, warped. I was firing without aiming, dodging without thought. The basin itself seemed to pulse faster with each heartbeat. At 2, the manuals of the basin soldiers all snapped shut. At 1, mine did too. At 0, everything stopped. The soldiers froze mid-step, mid-strike, weapons half raised. My own breath was the only sound. Then the manuals opened again, all in unison. The new heading read, March. The basin soldiers turned away from us and began moving toward the far horizon, formation unbroken. The surviving recruits, those whose eyes were still human, stood trembling, rifles hanging at their sides. The instructors didn't speak, they just pointed toward the same direction. The manual in my hands warmed again. Red text appeared, slow and deliberate: forward. We followed the departing column until the basin flattened into an ordinary plain, and the plain forgot it had ever been a basin. The enemy, our twins with book-bright eyes, marched on without checking if we kept pace. When the last line crossed a heat haze and blurred into the horizon, the manuals cooled a degree, and every page that wasn't page 1 went blank. No dismissal, no parameters, just the stillness that means a decision has been made somewhere you will never be invited. The veterans faced the way we'd come. Orla did too. I turned with them. The ridge was closer than it should have been, as if distance had been revised during combat to be more convenient. The thought arrived whole. We can make it back before dusk. We climbed in a staggered file, stepping into our own boot prints while pretending not to notice that some prints belonged to men who were no longer with us. The ridge shrugged underfoot. When we crested it, the base sat on its shelf exactly where a map would have put it. Walls of poured stone, gun towers like hunched shoulders, the outer gates a pair of teeth made to hold. Open this morning, closed now, not simply shut, sealed. The seam between the 2 doors had been swallowed into one continuous slab, the way a wound sometimes decides to heal by forgetting the body was ever 2 pieces there. The 3 locks were still visible, bright nodes like insects caught in amber. They had no keyholes. They had never had keyholes. The memory that they might once have opened felt like a childish story. We stood in the powder-fine dust without speaking. The floodlight towers at the corners were dark, but the glass eyes of the lenses found us the way a blind thing finds warmth. An instructor stepped from the shadow of the left tower. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't shake his head. He only looked at our manuals with that blank, coin-flat attention that slid off skin and sank into paper. Around me, recruits opened their books because they had learned the price of refusing to do so. I did too. The map page lay white as a shroud. No lines, no rooms, no range, no barracks. At the center where the base should have been, a single word lived in small, patient capitals: forward. I closed the book and opened it again. White. Forward. The letters didn't move, but their weight did. It settled into my thumb the way a snare drum's skin answers the heel of a hand. When I lifted the book away from my chest, the pressure followed like an animal that had found a new lap. Someone ran at the gate, with the kind of sprint you only have when a wall is still only a rumor. He hit the slab with both palms. The slab didn't protest. It didn't even pretend to be hard. It yielded a fraction, and then remembered it was a gate, not a mouth, and gave him back the same amount of himself he had given it. He reeled away, hands unhurt, dignity gone. No one laughed. We had not laughed in days measured in anything but breathing. Service saps, a veteran said, not loud. He meant the maintenance culverts cut under the outer wall for waste and air. He meant hope with a technical name. The manuals in 3 of our hands warmed as if pleased by the vocabulary. We followed him along the fence line until the ground dipped where we knew a grill had always been. The grill was there. It was also not there. The surface of it had the pattern of bars, but the spaces between them had been filled with stone that was the same texture as the rest of the wall, the way a drawing of a window can convince the eye there is glass. Orla knelt. She touched the pattern. Her finger came away clean. Paint, she said, meaning not pigment but intention. The manual against her ribs nudged her thumb toward the page. She didn't oblige. She stood and brushed her hands on her trousers as if dust was still a thing we could remove with rubbing. Behind us, the plane did the thing the plane does when it wants to prove that all directions are the same. It erased features one by one until the horizon was a rule written with a ruler. The wind lost interest. The sky leaned down. The manual in my hands warmed with a caution I had learned to read as hold. 2 recruits peeled away without permission and found the east gate. Another slab, another seam that had remembered it was impolite to have seams. They beat it with the butts of their rifles the way boys beat drums during festival days in towns that no longer exist. The sound didn't carry. The wall took it as if it were a compliment and fed it to whatever it keeps where stone keeps its pride. An instructor appeared by the right gate and the left at the same moment. One stared at the empty range. One stared at us. Their coats were clean. Their boots remembered how to scuff and chose not to. When they spoke, 3 syllables braided into one mouthful. Stand, present, forward. The manuals answered with a pulse that ran the line. Left, right, left, the way floodlights used to. Orla stepped closer to me until our sleeves touched. If the map will not tell us where we are, she said, it will tell us where it thinks we should be. She opened to the white and held the book at an angle until the red ink that wasn't there caught a light that wasn't there either. Ghost lines swam. For a moment I saw the barracks as we had known them. Straight corridor, latrine at the end, mess on the right, and then the lines slid like eels, and the corridor bent into a fold, and the latrine labeled itself restoration cell, and the mess hall doubled and faced itself across a corridor that had never existed in daylight. I reached to touch the page. The pressure under my thumb became warning. Do not believe the memory you prefer. The words weren't printed, but they lived in the sensation the way a scar keeps a story when the mouth is too tired to. Back to the basin, someone said. The veterans didn't turn. The instructor who had watched the range blinked once. The floodlight tower above him answered with the tiniest movement, the kind that can't be seen unless you are already committed to seeing it. A nod from a lamp. We tried a door not made for us. The sally port for officers and dignitaries, once a slit in the wall with its own little ceremony. It had smoothed into stone like a mouth that refuses to learn certain words. We put our manuals against it at the height of a human heart. Nothing. We placed them lower and higher, as if the gate were a machine with a reader we could sweet-talk into action. The books warmed dutifully and cooled without resentment. The wall pretended we were not asking questions, it had to dignify with answers. The veterans made circles in the dust with the toes of their boots and called it re. Orla traced the same circles with her eyes and called it grief. I opened my book to the map one more time and tried the oldest trick men have with paper. I breathed on it. Breath fogged the white a little and then vanished into fibrous patience. Forward remained. We can't all go forward, a recruit said, very quietly. Not mutiny. Arithmetic. Half of us still had the combat tremor that takes hours to burn out. 3 had burns on their forearms from range heat. 1 had a cut along his hairline that refused to bleed or close because his body had been taught to hold in everything. The base behind us had water, Medicae, bunks made with the kind of perfect corners that keep a man from dissolving when he lies down. Forward had none of that. The instructor at the right gate stepped into the shade of the arch that was no longer an arch and raised his manual with both hands. He held it as we had been taught to, pressed to the sternum, fingers meeting over the spine, elbows tucked prim as a ritual. The book opened to page 1 without his help. The words on it did not change,
The weight of them did. The phrase warmed along the line of my collarbone as if he had laid it there with a stamp. Congratulations, you're already dead. It was not mockery. It was a credential presented to a border guard. The word on the map page brightened a tone, not color. You learn to stop relying on color when ink chooses red and then chooses not red with equal authority. Tone. The weight of a letter when it knows it will not be negotiated with. Forward. 2 recruits broke rank and tried the old trick from Night Watch, stepping 1 foot over an invisible line to see if the world would accept it. The world did. It took the centimeters of boot sole they offered and made those centimeters belong to the other side forever. The men stepped back. Their heels did not return with them. No blood, no pain, just the kind of loss that teaches a brain to make new definitions for whole. We did not run. Running is a story people tell themselves about the kind of courage they will have when the room decides to be smaller. We stood and argued in breaths. The manual pulsed hold into my wrist and then with had always been the kinder order. It implied someone beside you who would pay the price of your obedience with you. Water, Orla said. Supplies. If forward means out, we will need. None, said a veteran, soft. You bring weight into a place that writes as it goes. It writes around your weight and calls it error. I didn't want him to be right. The manual warmed as if he were. The instructors began to walk along the wall at a pace that taught our feet how far apart to place themselves. The floodlight towers ticked left, right, left at the corners like omnibuses keeping a schedule no one living could read. The gate did not open. The base did not erase itself and redraw into the mercy. The map did not remember rooms just to comfort us. We gave up the fantasy in pieces, the way a man pays a debt in coins too small to matter until he has none left. Someone tried the vox. It hummed to acknowledge its own coil, and then stayed modestly useless. Someone else tried prayer. He remembered halfway through that we had been asked not to do that, and finished with his mouth closed and his eyes open. It worked as well as most prayers do. A sheet of dust lifted along the fence and moved a meter, no breeze visible. The manuals warmed as one and cooled as one, the left-right-left cadence shivering through the paper and the ribs beneath. The veterans pivoted toward the horizon with a relief that stung the eyes. Orla looked at me. We didn't nod. We had learned to save nods for rooms that deserve them. The map offered nothing but forward. The gate offered nothing but stone. The base turned the polite face of a building that has given you everything it was designed to give, and now expects you to go where the design says you will. We set our boots in the dust and made a line, because lines keep men from unraveling when there is no edge to walk along. The instructors fell in behind us, not ahead. That was the last courtesy. March, said a voice that might have been 1 man or 4. The manuals pulsed once each. The word on the map darkened. We did not look back when the first step drew us away from the wall. Habit said you glance at doors because doors sometimes forgive. Habit had been edited. By the time we reached the spot where the ridge stopped pretending to be a ridge and became plain again, the base had already done its last trick. I turned anyway, once against instruction and arithmetic, and saw only horizon behind us. The shelf, the towers, the teeth of the gate, all erased as neatly as a clerk draws a line through a page and moves on. The map had been honest after all. There was nothing left to draw. We walked until the sun remembered to lower itself by degrees, and the manuals refused to cool entirely. They stayed warm enough to feel like a hand you do not shake off when it rests between your shoulder blades. Forward sat at the center of the page, as patient as an animal at a door, confident the door had never been meant to open any way but out. Night would come. The plane would do its old magic, making a shape out of darkness and asking if we recognized it from Night Watch. The answer was in the wrist pulse, and the coin-flat eyes walking at our backs. We were already dead, and the map had finally drawn a world that believed us. We did not know where forward ended. We only knew there was no way back.
The first body appeared at dusk. We had been walking for hours across a plain that refused to end, just flat, cracked earth under a sky the same color as old lead, with the instructors pacing us like metronomes. The manuals remained open to forward, a constant pulse under our thumbs. No one asked where we were going anymore. That question had been burned out of us back at the gate. Orla spotted it first, a figure lying in the dust 30 paces ahead, face turned to the horizon as though still listening for an order. The uniform was PDF issue, same cut as ours, same stitched patch on the shoulder. The boots were regulation issue too, polished to an impossible shine despite the grit. And in his hands, held in perfect parade rest, was the manual. Open. Page 1. Congratulations, you're already dead. No signs of struggle, no wounds, no insects on the flesh, though the skin had that waxy stillness of long absence. It looked as though he had simply lain down in perfect formation and stopped. We marched past without breaking step. The instructors didn't slow, the manuals didn't change, but I noticed something then. The body's shadow lay in the wrong direction. It pointed toward the horizon we had left behind. Another appeared 50 meters later, then another, then a cluster of them, shoulder to shoulder, boots aligned, manuals open in unison like choir books, all the same. Page 1, all the same frozen serenity. The plane had become a formation, a regiment of the unmoving. The veterans didn't look down, they kept their eyes on the horizon, as if staring directly at the dead risk joining their ranks. Orla whispered under her breath. Not to me, not to anyone, but to the air. They're not just ours. I knew what she meant before I asked. Some wore insignia from other PDF units, names I didn't recognize, from worlds I'd never heard of. A few had minor differences in uniform design, patterns that hadn't been used in decades. One bore an Aquila patch, so faded it might have belonged to a generation before my parents were born. Yet their manuals were exactly the same as ours. Same black cover, same parchment tone, same cruel 6 words. We passed a man whose helmet visor was cracked through the middle. Behind it, his eyes were still open. They were the color of bleached glass, reflecting not the sky, but something deeper, something that moved just at the edge of perception. I glanced down at my own manual. The pulse skipped once, then returned. The dead grew thicker, arranged now in rows as precise as any parade ground. They weren't scattered casualties, they were a display, a memory pinned to the earth for inspection. Some sat upright, legs folded under them, manuals resting on their thighs. Others reclined, heads tilted back, staring at nothing. 1 or 2 knelt, spines bent forward as though frozen in prayer. "Why don't they smell?" a recruit behind me murmured. The answer came from a veteran without turning his head. "Because they haven't decided to be corpses." That should have been nonsense, but nothing in this march allowed for easy dismissal. A kilometer in, I realized the arrangement wasn't random. The bodies faced in alternating directions, one toward us, one toward our destination, one back the way we'd come, like markers in a game whose rules we hadn't been taught. When I looked at the faces of those facing us, I felt a prickling recognition, not familiarity exactly, more the uncomfortable sense that they were meant to be familiar, that if I stared long enough, I'd recognize something about the shape of the jaw, the set of the mouth. Orla hissed between her teeth. She had stopped mid-step, her gaze locked on one of the prone figures. I followed her eyes. It was her, or not her exactly. The face was a little thinner, the hair a fraction longer, but the bone structure was the same. Same scar across the eyebrow, same line of tension in the jaw. And in the corpse's hands, the manual. Page 1. The instructors didn't react. The veterans kept marching. I pulled Orla forward before she could kneel and touch the thing. We passed more doubles, not just her, others too. A recruit saw his own dead face, 10 rows deep. Another saw what might have been an older version of himself, jawline hardened, uniform rank higher, manual still open to the first page. One boy didn't see anyone at all, until he looked down at the body under his boot and saw his own mouth half buried in the dust. The manuals in our hands stayed open to forward, but now the word looked different, thicker, heavier, as if the ink itself had been mixed with soil from this plane. The sun finally touched the horizon, bleeding rust across the sky. That's when we saw the scale of it. The dead stretched as far as we could see, a silent army locked in eternal review. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands, all in perfect condition, no matter how old their uniforms, all with manuals open to page 1. Somewhere ahead, the line of our march curved, threading between 2 vast mounds of the dead. As we entered the narrow passage between them, the manuals in our hands grew warm, not the slow, patient warmth of the gate's command. This was sharper, more urgent, like the warning of a predator's breath on the back of your neck. I didn't want to look down. I did anyway. The 6 words had changed. Forward until you find yourself. I looked to Orla. She had seen it too. Her knuckles were white on the manual's spine. She mouthed the words once, as if tasting them. Then quietly she said, "What happens when you do?" The instructors gave no answer. They simply led us deeper into the field of the dead, and the manuals pulsed in time with our steps, as if pleased by our obedience. By the time the first stars blinked into the sky, the bodies had begun to change. Some now turned their heads slightly as we passed. Others shifted their manuals a fraction, as though marking our place in some invisible record. One sat bolt upright, the movement so sudden that several recruits stumbled back. It did not speak. It did not stand. It simply tilted its manual toward the nearest living soldier, and on its page 1, the 6 words were gone, replaced by a single, unfamiliar sentence. I didn't have time to read it before the instructors ordered us forward, and so we marched on, through the plain of our own deaths, with the manuals urging us toward whatever waited beyond the horizon. We saw the camp lights hours before we reached them. Not the harsh clinical glare of PDF flood lamps, but a flickering amber glow, as though the fires were older than the fuel they burned. The manuals pulsed in unison as we drew closer, not with the steady beat of forward, but with an uneven rhythm, 2 short pulses, 1 long. A signal, a knock at a door we couldn't yet see. The instructors halted us on the edge of the encampment. There was no order to rest, no command to lower our weapons. We simply stood there, staring into a semicircle of shapes moving in the light. They were men in PDF uniforms, but wrong. Their insignia didn't match ours. Some were patterns I'd never seen before. Others bore the stamp of regiments I thought were myths from old campaign logs. Their uniforms were faded but immaculate, pressed flat, free of dust despite the wasteland wind, and in their hands, manuals. Not all were black like ours. Some were deep crimson, others green so dark it was nearly black, a few bound in flaking leather. But when the nearest one flipped his open, the page was the same, 6 words in clean, unbroken print. "Congratulations, you're already dead." Our instructors stepped forward, manuals held like weapons. The strangers mirrored the movement exactly, and then without warning they spoke in unison, "Forward until you find yourself." The voice was layered, not just many speaking at once, but each syllable containing a faint echo, as though something else spoke with them from far deeper inside. A shape stepped between them, tall, lean, wearing an officer's coat that looked centuries old. A captain, if the tarnished rank pins on his collar could still be trusted. His manual hung from a chain at his side, its spine polished smooth from years of use. "You're wondering what this is," he said. His voice was human, but every few words seemed to drag, like it had to fight through static. "The manual, the drills, page 1. No one answered, but his smile suggested he didn't need us to. "You think you were drafted when the administratum called your name. You think your life before this was yours. It wasn't. You were drafted before you were born." I felt Orla's hand tighten on my sleeve. The wind hissed through the dead plain behind us, stirring the open pages. The captain gestured toward the corpses stretching out into the darkness. "Those are your predecessors. Not all of them wore this world's dirt on their boots. Some fought under suns you've never seen. Others never saw combat at all. They all opened the book." He tapped the manual at his hip. "And when you open it, you enter the roster." A murmur moved through our line. I didn't know if it came from us or from the manuals. "What does it do?" one of the recruits demanded. "What's in it?" The captain's smile widened a fraction. "It's not just a book. It's a construct, part psychoweapon, part machine spirit. It doesn't record your orders. It records you. Every thought, every reflex, every instinct you have from the moment you touch page 1. He paced slowly in front of us, his boots leaving no mark in the dirt. "The administratum calls it an indoctrination interface. The Mechanicus has other names. I prefer the truth. It's a chain, one that doesn't break when your pulse does." Orla spoke then, voice low but steady. "That's why the bodies don't rot." "Yes," the captain said, almost kindly. "They're not bodies. They're placeholders. When you die, your consciousness, or enough of it, is absorbed. Your skills, your loyalty, your fear, they become part of the manual's will. And when the time comes, the manual decides who gets to walk again. The campfire's light warped slightly, as if the air itself was bending under the weight of the words. I realized, with a cold lurch in my gut, that none of the officers' shadows reached the ground. You're saying, we're all ready? Another recruit began. Dead? Not yet, the captain interrupted, but you will be. And when you are, you'll march again. Maybe tomorrow, maybe in 1,000 years, maybe under your own name, maybe under a number, but you will march. Someone at the back of our formation tried to step away. The manual in his hands snapped shut with a noise like bone breaking. He screamed and dropped it, clutching his wrists. When he looked up, the officers had moved closer, too close without a sound. The captain stooped, picked up the fallen manual, and returned it to the recruit. Don't drop it again. The manual doesn't like to be abandoned. Orla leaned toward me, her voice barely audible over the low hum in the air. How do we break it? The captain must have heard. His eyes, or what I thought were his eyes, shifted toward us. For a moment they seemed to deepen, pulling the firelight inward. You don't, you serve. And if we refuse? I asked, surprising myself. He laughed once, sharply. Then you serve without knowing it. The manual doesn't require your consent, only your contact. He turned, walking back toward the ring of silent officers. Your instructors will take you the rest of the way. The final drills will prepare you. He paused at the edge of the firelight, looking over his shoulder. And when you reach the last page, remember what you saw here. Then he was gone, not walking into the dark, gone as if he had never been there. The instructors stepped back into place at the head of the column. Without a word, the manuals in our hands flipped back to forward. The hum under our skin grew stronger, and we began to march again, the dead plain stretching ahead like an open book. The encampment firelight died, as if snuffed by a careful hand. Our manuals cooled to the steadiness of a waiting heart, and the instructors led us away from the ring of officers into a stretch of plain that looked like every other stretch of plain until it didn't. The ground buckled once, the way a chest lifts at the first breath after drowning, and a shape rose out of the dust. A long, low structure with no seams and no doors, matte and lightless, edges too straight for anything the wind ever made. It had the feel of a place you remember before you've seen it. The manuals warmed together. The instructors stepped forward, and the wall in front of them forgot that it was a wall. An opening became true. Inside, a hall, narrow, tall enough to make heads tilt, lit by strip lumens that hummed 3 notes and then held the lowest. The air tasted of old oil and something antiseptic, a cleaned wound that still remembered blood. Benches lined both sides, each with a thin shelf above sized for a manual, and nothing else. At the far end, a plinth the height of a man's chest, its surface angled like a lectern. We filed in 2 by 2, and the opening closed behind us with the sensation, not the sound, of a door deciding you were acceptable. The instructors took station along the walls. Their glass eyes reflected the strips into flat coins. They spoke together, syllables braided until the mouth forgot which throat they came from. Final drill. No cadence. No pages to turn. We stood breathing in a room that didn't echo, as if the walls had been lined with felt to spare the manual the indignity of hearing anything but itself. The plinth lit, not with light, with attention. A manual lay upon it, larger than ours, older, its leather scuffed to a smoothness that came only from being handled by hands that had forgotten being hands. The cover bore no sigil, no aquila, no stamp. When it opened, it did so without showing page 1. It opened in the middle, where spines learn to give. Form ranks, said the instructors, and our feet obliged before our minds could resist. 2 files, facing the plinth, Orla to my right, a veteran to my left whose manual spine had become cloth through use. Do not speak, the instructors said, and even the breath in my throat asked permission before it moved. At the sound, step forward 1, place your manual on the shelf, flip 1 page. The sentence lay in the air like a wire. If the sound repeats, the next steps. If it does not, the line holds. The plinth book turned its own page and exposed text that wasn't text, lines of ink that moved like river water under frost. My manual warmed at the sternum. Witness or obey. Here the words were siblings. The sound came, not a tone, the turn, a dry, deliberate rasp I had learned to fear in the barracks, the latrine, the range, the sound of a page deciding it wished to be somewhere else. The first recruit stepped forward 1 pace. He set his manual on the shelf as instructed, thumbs poised at the lower corner. He looked young suddenly, cheeks that had worn grit and still had room under the dirt for softness. He flipped 1 page. He died like the first silence, without spectacle. Breath left, knees unlocked, hands relaxed. The manual did not fall. It slid into rest on his chest as his body remembered gravity. The strips hummed on, indifferent. The instructors didn't blink. The sound came again. The next stepped. Page. Collapse. A third. Page. Collapse. No markings appeared on plinth or wall. No tally. The room did not care for scores. I counted anyway, the way a man counts beads, because the fingers must have something to do that the mind can call prayer. By 10, I learned the pattern of the deaths. Small muscles first, then large, then the eyes turning glass with a courtesy that spared us horror. By 20, I understood the cruelty of the drill. Obedience had an endpoint you could see without being allowed to reach. At 23, the sound paused. The line held. The strips flickered once, and in that slippage I thought I saw shadows between the lumens. Figures standing on the far side of the light, books in hand, waiting their turn in a room parallel to ours. The sound, step, page, all as fingers bit into the spine of her manual. "It kills us to fill itself," she whispered, and the whisper still felt too loud. "Do not speak," the instructors said, not harsh, just complete. 27, 29, 31. I felt the urge to cheat. Leaf 2 pages at once when my turn came. Make a bargain with arithmetic. As if the book would not know. As if the book would not be the clerk, and the clerk the judge. At 33, the veteran to my left moved. He stepped early. The sound had not yet come. He placed his manual on the shelf with tenderness, and flipped backward, to page 1. He did not die. The instructors watched him without expression. He read the 6 words, and smiled for the first time since I had met him. "Present," he said, and it was not to the clerk, it was to the room beyond rooms. The sound came late. The recruit beyond him stepped. Page. Collapse. The veteran's smile stayed. His book warmed. I could feel it through the air, a heat matched to the strips. He closed the manual and held it to his chest, and did not step back into the rank. He leaned his shoulder against the wall as if tired. The line continued. 41, 42. The sound. Step. Page. A recruit I'd shared ration biscuits with went soft at the knees and lay down as if taking a nap he had earned. The body didn't cool. The air refused to leach heat, as if the room were ajar with the lid on, conserving. At 45, the plinth book turned itself, and for a breath the symbols on the open page aligned into something legible to eyes that had never learned that alphabet. Roster. Then the letters flowed again, names invisible and visible at once, as if I could read them if only I could admit I had written them. Why? All I asked. Not to the instructors, not to me. To the shelf, to the arrangement. Why pages for lives? A drill master answered with the first kindness I had ever heard from a mouth that could not be kind. Because you learn to measure yourselves in them. The sound. Step. Page. 51. 52. Fewer of us remained. The room's hum deepened. The way a machine changes note as load increases. The corpses, no, the placeholders, lay with manuals resting on chests like small obedient beasts. Their covers did not reflect the strips. Their leather drank light. At 57, the sound paused long enough for me to feel relief. Relief is a trap, a sudden softness in the joints that makes the floor feel farther away. When the turn came, it came loud enough that my hands twitched toward the shelf without my feet moving. The recruit ahead of me stepped. Aula was 2 down.
My breath shortened to coin-sized sips. I did not want to watch her die as the drill intended me to, as a lesson in sequence. I wanted to break rank, to find scissors, to cut a page. There were no scissors. Even if there had been, the paper would have refused. The sound. Orla stepped. Her manual touched the shelf and warmed under her palm. She didn't look at the page. She looked at me. Something passed across her face. Fear. Yes, but not only that. Agreement. We had been agreeing for days without the luxury of speech. She flipped. She did not fall. The strips dimmed a fraction. The hum stuttered, then recovered. The instructors inclined their heads not as men do, but as a chassis does when a technician finds the torque that was required all along. Orla stood with her manual open to, not page 1, something deeper, lines that moved. The plinth book responded, a ripple down its spine like an animal tolerating a touch. The sound came again, as if the room wanted to paper over the exception with obedience. The man behind her stepped. Page. Collapse. I counted the living with a soldier's math. 1, 2, 8, 12, then fewer, then the count that lives in the mouth when the mind refuses to record the number of funerals left. The corpses were neat. The shelves started to fill with manuals that faced outward like eyes. When my turn came, it did so without ceremony. The sound, the step, the shelf under my hands had the texture of bone polished by worry. I set the manual down and felt heat in the paper, the pulse that had been companion, warning, tutor. It climbed my fingers and wrote itself along the nerves as if signing a ledger at wrist and elbow and shoulder. I looked at Orla. Her manual's page was unreadable to me but legible to her. She nodded once. It was the last nod I would spend. I flipped one page. For a second there was nothing. Then there was nothing sharpened into edge. Breath went not out but through, as if a hole had been refined in me for the purpose. Sound in the room drew away down a long corridor. I waited for the floor. It didn't come. The manual warmed, then cooled, then settled at body temperature as if it had chosen to believe I was already the same as itself. I did not fall. The instructors did not register surprise. Surprise is a human hobby, but the Hume shifted key, a hair flatter. The plinth book rippled again. The veteran at the wall smiled with his mouth closed, the way men smile in churches when something heretical and true sits down beside them. The sound came for the next in line. Page. I stepped back into rank with legs that belonged to someone who had learned a new meaning for present. The drill chewed the line. 70, 73, 80. Fewer voices left to hold silence down. The strips buzzed like summer insects trapped in a jar. Orla's face had taken on that particular stillness, not resignation, not peace of a person who has discovered a door in herself and is waiting to see if walking through makes noise. At 91 the sound failed. The room waited. The instructors said nothing. The plinth book did not turn. Somewhere behind the far wall a weight settled. The way a building settles after you remove a column and discover the ceiling had learned to carry itself. 92, the veteran murmured. He had not been invited to count. He did anyway. 93, there was no 94. In the end we were 3. Orla, the veteran, and me. The floor was crowded with placeholders who would not rot and manuals who would not forget. The plinth book closed itself to a thickness that suggested an ending. Final action, said the instructors, and the braid of voices contained something like approval and something like grief, and something like nothing at all. The plinth slid open along a seam I would have sworn had not been there. Inside, a recess shaped for a manual. Mine warmed, Orla's did too. 1 enters, the instructors said. 2 proceed. The veteran didn't hesitate. He took his manual in both hands and laid it in the recess as if laying down a child. The strips dimmed. The room exhaled. His body did not fall. It widened, the way a shadow widens when a light moves. His mouth shaped one word that did not require air. Forward. Then he was not gone. Distributed. The hum gained a harmony. My manual pulsed once. In time with a pulse the room had been keeping without me. The opening closed. The door behind us decided to be a door again. Dust eddied under it, like breath under a sheet. The instructors stepped aside, hands behind backs, coin eyes reflecting all the light the strips had left to offer. Orla's manual flipped on its own and showed a last page I could not see. She looked at it a long moment, then at me. We're the ones who carry it out, she said. It wasn't a question. It was the sentence she had decided would be true until something stronger took it away. The instructors as one. Dismiss. The hall did not empty. Only we did. The door let us through with the quiet of a room relieved of guests. Outside, night had drawn its line over the plain. The encampment fires that had been there were not. The dead lay in their rows, manuals open to page 1, as patient as the first time I learned the 6 words. We stood under a sky that had stopped pretending to have stars, and the manuals in our hands were heavier by 1 friend and 1 debt. Behind us, the hall sighed itself back into plain. We were 2. The page at the center of my book was blank, but the paper had the tense feel of an ear that has chosen to listen. From somewhere in the dark beyond the dead came the low, layered sound I had heard in the officers' voices and under the instructor's orders. Not words. Invitation. Orla closed her book and set it to her chest like armor. Forward, she said. We marched.
The plain stretched out in front of us, empty, except for the rows of still bodies lying like punctuation marks on the sentence the drill had written in bone. Orla walked half a step ahead, the manual in her arms not clutched like a weapon, but held like something that had chosen her. We didn't speak. Words here felt borrowed. The night was windless, but the air moved in a way that suggested it was being pulled from us gently, the way a page is turned in a book you don't realize you're inside. We crossed the plain until the ground itself decided we'd gone far enough. A single doorway stood there, freestanding, unsupported, framed in metal, older than any structure I had seen on this world. It had no hinges, no latch, just a frame and an absence where the door might have been. We stepped through, and the world changed without the courtesy of a transition. We were back at the parade square. Not our parade square, a cleaner one. The benches unbroken, the lamps burning steady white instead of the orange haze I'd come to know. The banners snapped with pride instead of fatigue. Rows of recruits stood in perfect formation, manuals in their left hands, heads high. At the front of the square, an instructor turned. His glass eyes caught the light. He smiled. It was not a human smile. Orla took 1 step forward. I followed. The rows didn't react to us. They were looking somewhere past us, somewhere through us. Their lips moved in unison, and though I couldn't hear the words, I could feel the rhythm. 6 syllables, measured, final. From behind us, another voice spoke. It was close enough that I could feel the faint tick of breath on my neck. Except breath is warm, and this was cold, the temperature of paper stored too long in the dark. Now you understand. I turned. The instructor stood there, the same coin eyes, the same perfect posture. He was the same man, or the same thing wearing the same man's shape, who had handed me my manual on the first day. Only now I saw the faint lines around his lips, not wrinkles, creases, like fold lines on a well-read page. He nodded to my hands. I looked down. My manual was open. The last page stared back at me. It was blank. No, not blank. The surface of the paper shimmered faintly, and as I leaned in, I saw the shape of my own face reflected there. The ink, if it was ink, flowed in tiny, imperceptible movements, as if rewriting my outline over and over, making sure it had it right. The reflection smiled. I didn't. Behind me the formation shifted, boots scraped in unison. A new batch of recruits stepped forward in perfect drill step. They passed through me without resistance, their bodies brushing like the edges of paper sliding against paper. The instructor's voice folded itself into my ears. Formation. The world blinked. I was standing in the front row. My boots were polished. My uniform was clean. The manual in my hand felt new. Page 1 was open. 6 words stared up at me in black ink that was still wet. Congratulations, you're already dead. I tried to drop it. My fingers didn't move. The instructor's footsteps passed behind us, slow, measured, satisfied. Somewhere deep in my mind, behind whatever had been rewritten, a thought tried to claw its way out. This isn't the first time. The thought didn't survive. The horn blew. We marched. But not before I tell you this, and I'll tell you only once. If you ever see this manual, close it, burn it, run. Because if you read page 1, you'll find yourself here, and the next story will be yours. For those who survived listening to this tale, the cycle only ends if the story spreads. Like this, share this, subscribe for the next warning before it's too late. If you don't, well, page 1 is waiting for you.